Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Julie Jensen. Mark Jensen was a successful man, a husband and father from the quiet, cozy town of Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, USA, with a population of about 20,000 people. This typical suburb is safe, featuring many parks and walking trails. Mark worked as a broker, achieved success in this field. His career allowed him to provide a comfortable life for himself and his family. Additionally, he had quite flexible working conditions. Mark could take a vacation at any time, enjoying good privileges all thanks to his successful work. Mark was married to Julie, whom he met in 1981. They began dating in the spring of 1981 and then got married. Julie worked as a salesperson in a store. Their first child, named David, was born in 1990, and their second, Douglas, was born in 1995. After Douglas's birth, Julie decided to leave her job and become a housewife. Her husband's income was more than enough to provide for the entire family, allowing her to become an ideal mother for her boys. From the outside, their married life looked perfect. However, since 1991, they struggled with a serious problem that haunted Julie for the next 7 years. It began with an incident that felt like a bad joke. The first time she received someone else's candid photo stuck in her front door, no one paid any attention to it. However, similar incidents began to happen repeatedly, and later, emails with suspicious content appeared. Calls started coming to their home phone, but the unknown caller would simply remain silent and hang up after a few seconds. Checking the number was ineffective, as it could not be tracked. Julie tried to ignore the unpleasant episodes, sending the letters to spam and hanging up when the caller remained silent. But everything began to repeat itself in real life with frightening regularity, causing her anxiety and fear. It seemed that some unknown person was trying to intimidate her, penetrating deeper into her everyday life. Julie understood that the stalker was somewhere nearby. One day, she found that someone had moved all the garden furniture. Mark claimed that he had not done it. The most terrifying moment came when she walked out onto the porch one morning and saw a suspicious car parked across the road. As soon as she looked at it, the car took off and sped away. This experience frightened her and led her to develop paranoia. This behavior was repeated multiple times. Julie contacted the police, but in the small provincial area where they lived, there were not enough officers to fully address her problem. According to regulations in such situations, the case should have been transferred to a larger department specializing in harassment, but for some unknown reason, this did not happen. Probably, the authorities simply did not take her problem seriously. Frustrated, Mark decided to take the case into his own hands. Julie began to keep a journal in which she documented each incident in detail. This went on for several years. Finally, she approached the police with her journal and shared a story that had been kept quiet until then because it involved a very shameful episode. According to Julie, in 1991, she had a brief affair with an old colleague, name is Perry Tarika. They had a lot in common. He was going through a divorce at the time, and Julie was experiencing difficulties in her marriage, feeling distance from Mark, whom she regarded more as a father figure. This distance led her to seek an outlet in a new relationship. The affair began as a friendship that developed into light flirting. One evening in 1991, Julie invited Perry over for dinner while Mark was on a business trip. After dinner, she offered him to stay the night. However, instead of the relief she expected, she felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, so much so that it suffocated her. Around this time, the harassment began. Julie also started visiting a psychologist, as she felt she was developing depression. She remembered that her mother had suffered from this illness and ultimately sank into alcoholism, so she wanted to avoid repeating that fate. The doctor diagnosed her with postpartum depression and prescribed antidepressants. After her visit to the doctor, she attempted to lift the burden of guilt by confessing her infidelity to Mark. Unfortunately, this did not help and only worsened the situation, leading Julie to file for divorce. Despite this, both spouses still hoped to maintain their relationship for the sake of their children. They even consulted a counselor, and Julie eventually withdrew her divorce application. Another problem remained: the stalking continued. Julie was convinced that this was the same Perry seeking revenge for their breakup. The detectives listened attentively to Julie's story. They accepted her application and promised to start an investigation. Contrary to Mark and Julie's expectations, however, the case never progressed. They decided to take matters into their own hands and hired a private detective, who quickly provided some interesting information. First of all, the detective discovered that Perry had moved to North Carolina during this period, almost 10 hours away from Wisconsin. Given how often the stalker appeared in Wisconsin, it seemed impossible for Perry to influence Julie while leading a normal life and working constantly. When he learned of the stalking, he even wrote her a letter expressing concern for her safety. Unfortunately, Julie didn't believe it. She still was convinced that the stalker was Perry. When she received the letter, she did not reply but instead took it to the police. Despite the detective's skepticism about Perry being the stalker, Julie and Mark continued to suspect him, especially after Perry learned about the stalking. The number of adult photos increased, and Mark became a victim of harassment multiple times. He also began to receive adult photos, which appeared everywhere he went, at his office, in his car, and even in a park. This had a very irritating effect on him, particularly because of the content of the images. Various photos depicted a man and a woman having intimate, but their faces were obscured. Mark endured this for a long time but eventually began to suspect the images might be of his wife. When he confronted Julie about this, they had a serious discussion. Despite her depressed state and overwhelming guilt, Julie insisted that the images were not hers. However, she began to believe that these photos might have been taken by Perry during a night they spent together. As a result, they turned to a private detective once again, determined to catch and punish the obsessive stalker. At that point, Mark figured out that this images most frequently appeared on Friday afternoons. He suggested setting up an ambush where the private detective could hide and watch for the stalker. Unfortunately, the plan failed as the stalker did not show up, seemingly aware of their scheme. The detective then decided to check Mark and Julie's phones. A tracking device was installed with the expectation that the couple would receive a silent call, allowing them to trace its origin. Amazingly, the calls stopped as soon as they set this up, leaving them perplexed. Concerned, they checked their home for wiretaps, but the detective found nothing. Julie financed this operation for several months and spent a great deal of money, but none of the tricks to catch the attacker were successful. The stalker disappeared, and they eventually relinquished the services of the private detective. Amid this turmoil, Julie's depressive state only worsened. She felt that because of her affair, her marriage could fall apart again. This cycle of anxiety and depression continued until December 1998. Julie was still struggling with her mental health when her prescription medication ran out, and she stopped taking the prescribed drugs. Around this time, she noticed a decline in her physical health. She felt weak, could barely walk and talk. She had difficulty thinking. The doctor prescribed her old antidepressants again and discussed her life problems. Even then, she still cried sporadically and felt guilty about her infidelity. Her depressive state lingered. But at least there was some relief in that the harassment had stopped. Everything they had done seemed to work. When the home phone was wiretapped, the calls ceased, and since the fall of 1998, she had not received any adult photographs. However, during this same period, Julie noticed some unpleasant changes. Beginning in August of that year, Mark started to treat her much colder. They had always spent a lot of time together, walking with their children, but now he increasingly made unpleasant comments towards her. It seemed that Mark was simply dissatisfied with everything, and he was not shy about expressing his discontent. Even in front of strangers, he exhibited behavior that overwhelmed his spouse. It was a bit strange. After 7 years of incessant persecution, Julie could finally engage fully in restoring the relationship. However, she felt more unhappy than ever. She told the therapist about her feelings during her appointment. At this time she felt physically unwell, thinking she might be catching a cold from the children. 2 days later, on December 3, 1998, Mark took the children to school and returned home, where he found 40-year-old Julie in bed. She was lying under the blanket on her stomach, appearing as if she were sleeping. Her husband assumed she was not feeling well again due to depression and left her alone for a while. However, he experienced anxiety, so he later decided to check on her and noticed that she was not breathing. Mark confirmed his suspicions and immediately contacted the 911 emergency service. When the police arrived at Jenson's house, Mark was visibly upset. He cried as he led everyone into the bedroom, where Julie lay under the blanket, unconscious. He believed she was dead, and after some time, it was impossible to resuscitate her. No wounds were found on her body. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no weapons or drugs nearby that could have been used to poison herself. It appeared her death was due to natural causes. Mark told the police that his wife had been unwell for several days prior. During this period, she had taken sleeping pills to fall asleep, rarely getting out of bed or even speaking. One arm was unnaturally bent beneath her body, suggesting that she could not have fallen asleep in such a position, leading to questions about why her husband left her in that state. In addition, Mark mentioned that she had recently resumed taking antidepressants prescribed by her doctor. He noted that several bottles were on the table, but they remained full. According to Mark, several of these drugs were new to Julie. He believed her illness and death were a result of a conflict between medications. He claimed that, in recent months, Julie had been struggling with a particularly severe stage of depression and, ultimately, could not cope, leading to suicide. However, there was no suicide note or anything similar in the bedroom, which seemed strange. Julie would not have ignored her sons and loved ones without leaving a farewell message. Mark willingly cooperated with the police, granting permission to search the house and the surrounding area. It was clear that Mark was very upset and simply wanted to understand what had happened. Soon, Mark's father arrived at the house, and the two men spoke alone. When they went outside, they were met by a crowd of locals who had gathered due to the commotion. Mark boldly declared that Julie died due to the incompatibility of the medications she had been actively taking lately. It seemed he was trying to calm the crowd, but the statement was too bold, as the investigation had just begun and any assumption needed to be proven or disproved, especially since no autopsy had been performed yet. Such confidence could arouse suspicion from the police. Immediately following these events, the relationship between Mark and Julie's family deteriorated. The reason was that Julie wanted to be buried with her relatives, but her husband insisted that her body, once examined, be cremated. Then they approached Mark with a request to arrange a memorial evening so that everyone who wished could say goodbye to Julie and share a portion of her ashes, but he simply refused to engage. There was much speculation about what happened to the ashes. Mark avoided the topic but later admitted that his son David scattered the ashes over the lake. This caused discontent among Julie's relatives and appeared questionable. When the toxicology report arrived, everything became even more confusing. In fact, Julie had not overdosed on any dangerous drugs. During the autopsy, the medical examiner found only one strange thing: Julie's facial bones looked somewhat deformed, as if they were not broken but on the verge of cracking. The medical examiner had never encountered anything like this before and could not confirm what it could be, but it all seemed suspicious. More valuable information emerged from their computer. It was discovered that Mark was the primary user. There were emails he had sent to one of his colleagues named Kelly Lobante. The letters turned out to be very personal, at times even intimate. Kelly was an assistant to management in the company, but in another city. It turned out that Mark had visited that city a couple of times for work from the middle of the summer, where he met Kelly. Kelly had just gotten married before meeting Mark, but that did not stop her from starting to date another man behind her spouse's back. Interestingly, the incident began in August, coinciding with the time Julie stopped receiving the adult photos, which was also when Mark seemed to be cold towards Julie. All this did not seem like a simple coincidence. In the browser history, there were more disturbing searches. Mark regularly made various requests concerning drugs and dangerous poisons, showing particular interest in antifreeze. The danger of antifreeze is that it is widely available, and even a relatively small dose can be fatal. Another problem is that it does not produce specific symptoms. It makes the person feel unwell, while they are actually being poisoned and gradually dying. Upon discovering the suspicious interest in Mark, a decision was made to test Julie's preserved blood sample for antifreeze. The detectives conducted a specialized analysis and were able to find small traces of the substance, but only traces. They considered this a very important finding. If Julie had wanted to voluntarily leave this life, she would have obviously consumed a larger quantity of antifreeze so that the result would indicate a 100% lethal dose, which would have killed her immediately. The fact that there were only small traces of antifreeze indicated that she may have been methodically poisoned over a long period. Additionally, the substance was not found in the bedroom or anywhere else in the house, suggesting that the victim could not have ingested it by accident. A computer scan revealed that on the morning of her death, Mark had made alarming searches regarding antifreeze. After he read the information, he immediately cleared the search history, apparently trying to cover his tracks. However, he likely was not aware that this could be recovered. All suspicions fell on Mark, especially since his wife was bedridden due to severe depression and their children were too young to use the computer on their own. There was only one person left who could have made those troubling requests. When communicating with the police, Mark stated that on December 3rd, the day Julie died, he had a strong desire to call an ambulance due to his wife's condition, but Julie insisted that he not do so. He interpreted this as a direct order, believing her desire to part with life was voluntary. Mark underestimated the situation, choosing to listen to his wife. Results from several examinations established that the cause of death for Julie was not straightforward. Upon detailed investigation, it was revealed that her nose had become so deformed it was almost broken, likely indicating that Mark had used a pillow to suffocate her by pressing it against her face until she could no longer breathe. Unfortunately, there was no material evidence directly linking him to the murder. Everything remained as mere speculation supported by circumstantial evidence. Suddenly, a friend of Julie brought a letter to the police station that Julie had written and given to her a few days before her death. In this letter, Julie stated that if anything happened to her, her husband should be blamed. It served as a detailed account of their troubled marriage. She expressed regret for a short affair with a man named Perry and proudly stated that she did not become an alcoholic like her mother, despite Mark's attempts to influence her. Julie detailed the medication she was taking and emphasized that she would never take her own life, especially for her children, whom she loved more than anything in the world. Her friend mentioned that Julie had previously voiced her suspicion that her husband wanted to kill her, and she had suggested going to a women's shelter. Although Julie considered this option seriously to protect herself and her children, she ultimately decided against it, fearing that Mark would find her, try to take the boys away. During this period, Julie communicated multiple times, even with acquaintances. She willingly shared her story, seemingly spreading information deliberately so that, if something happened to her, the police would have clear indications of the culprit, her husband. When speaking with Mark, the detectives did not reveal that they had information regarding his affair. So he lied, claiming that Kelly was merely a colleague. However, under pressure, he quickly admitted that he had met with her several times. Curiously, just a few days after Julie's death, Kelly left her husband and moved in with Mark. He fully financed her, supported her. Against this backdrop, Mark's lie seemed strange. The detectives continued to question the main suspect, but he denied almost everything. Finally, after hours of interrogation, Mark confessed, not to murder but to something else. According to him, although he was not the initial pursuer of Julie, and this suspicious man quickly backed off. Mark had kept numerous adult photos he had collected during that period. When he disapproved of his wife's actions, he staged a persecution to make her feel guilty and ashamed. He claimed he never intended to bring her to a tragic end. After 4 hours of interrogation, the police had no grounds for arrest, so they simply let Mark go. Several months passed. The newly minted couple, Kelly and Mark, continued living together. Mark launched a successful construction business. In March 2002, he proposed to Kelly, who accepted. They even placed an engagement announcement in the newspaper. More than a year had passed since Julie's death, and the investigation remained ongoing. However, the authorities were never able to find any direct evidence against the main suspect, Mark Jensen, who was arrested only in March 2002 on suspicion of first-degree murder. He had enough money to hire a good lawyer and post bail of $500,000. After that, he was released and returned to his normal life while the police continued to look for new evidence to send him to jail. Contrary to the expectations of Julie's family, this led to the charges being dropped. The children were small when their mother died, and by this time, they had even begun to call Mark's new wife his mom. The boys were in school, and Kelly became pregnant. After this, it seemed that Julie was simply forgotten. Her case became another unsolved mystery. Unexpectedly, 8 years after Julie's death, a new witness emerged, Ed Klug, who had worked with Mark about a month before Julie's death. They attended a business conference, got to talking, and later went to a bar for drinks. There, Mark drank too much and, overwhelmed with emotions, admitted that his marriage was not as good as he wanted it to be. He even said that he hated Julie and wanted her dead. Mark confided that you could poison your spouse with Benadryl, pool chemicals, or ethylene glycol. Based on this testimony, the police had the opportunity to arrest Mark again. This time, bail was set at $2 million. Although Mark's accounts contained more than $1 million, he did not have enough money to post bail and remained behind bars until January 2008 when the trial began. According to toxicological examinations, it was determined that Julie had undergone 3 stages of antifreeze poisoning. Mark had searched for information online many times, including on the very day his wife died. According to the prosecutor's office, he was never able to forgive Julie for her betrayal despite her repentance. He tormented her for a long time and enjoyed her suffering. He decided to finally get rid of her when his affair with Kelly began. Mark's defense attorney insisted that Julie drank the antifreeze herself to voluntarily end her life, claiming that the note she wrote before her death was designed to frame him, whom she had hated for many years. The hearings lasted 7 weeks, after which the jury needed days to decide on the outcome of the trial. Mark Jensen was found guilty of first-degree murder. He burst into tears when sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer immediately began fighting for his freedom by filing appeals, which worked. A federal judge overturned the conviction and ordered his release from prison. Agreeing with the lawyer's argument that the prosecutor's use of his late wife's words violated his constitutional, as his wife could not testify due to her death. The last trial began in January 2023. The defense successfully ensured that the note given to the police by the victim's friend was not used as evidence of guilt, which was a significant blow to the prosecution, as much of their case was built around it. Mark clearly tried to justify himself in every way possible and even became a victim of fraud during this process. His cellmate offered to testify for $1,000. Mark confided in one of his cellmates about his troubled marriage. He admitted to initially giving his wife antifreeze and described how he ultimately forced her to drink it for the last time on December 3, 1998. He went to bed with his wife. Julie Jensen was suffocating. He just lay there and watched her suffer. He then calmly took the children to school but was outraged that Julie never died while he was away, so he took a pillow, turned her onto her back, which caused her hand to assume an unnatural position, pressed the pillow against her face, nearly breaking her facial bones. According to his cellmate, Mark had been poisoning his wife by administering antifreeze in small doses over time. Even Kelly testified against him at the retrial. She was no longer the wife of the killer, having divorced about a year after his arrest, but she raised his 3 children. Interestingly, it became clear who had been persecuting Julie all those years: her husband. He had found out about her betrayal from the beginning and wanted to torture her, relishing in her suffering. Investigators found a fake email with explicit photos of other people that Mark had sent to himself while changing the sender's name to create the impression that someone else had sent it. This sophisticated, long-term torture was calculated, and he even skillfully portrayed himself as a victim. On April 14, 2023, Mark was again sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He remains behind bars. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Jen Carson. James Carson was a typical American in the 80s. He married a girl named Lynn, and they had a daughter named Jen. James was not particularly intelligent. He was more focused on family and children, always treating his loved ones with great love. He was a devoted father, but during that time, the hippie culture was gaining momentum, and James did not shy away from it. He loved to have fun and indulged in the forbidden. Nevertheless, his daughter remembered him as a very caring man who often told her stories at night. James did not work. Instead, his more educated wife, who had a decent job, provided for the family. At first, it appeared to be a loving union, but over the years, striking changes began to occur in him. He became increasingly rude and aggressive, bought himself a gun, and periodically threatened his wife with it. Lynn decided it was better to separate after 10 years of marriage. Their 5-year-old daughter Jen was too young to understand what was happening. Most of the events that unfolded remained a mystery to her until she grew older and learned the shocking truth about her father. However, the key character in this story is not only James but also Susan, a woman born into a wealthy family in the 60s. Her father was a highly successful producer who granted her a lavish lifestyle. She could only dream of such a life. She married another wealthy man, resulting in 2 children. However, as Susan's children reached their teenage years, she grew weary of the daily routine and wanted to get the most out of life. Therefore, she began a second secret life, which she kept hidden from her family. Susan became quite dissolute, preferring much younger men with whom she engaged in intimate relationships. One of her young lovers introduced her to banned substance, which had become widespread at that time. This marked the beginning of the end of her idyllic life. It turned out that Susan had not only secret affairs but also mental health issues, which no one had ever addressed. The lack of treatment combined with her reckless lifestyle led to exacerbations of her condition, resulting in regular hallucinations, even when she was in a normal state of consciousness. One day, her husband returned home from work to find triangles drawn on all the walls. Susan spoke of visual hallucinations and showed signs of schizophrenia. Her husband uncovered her little secrets about her affairs on the side and discovered her mental disorders. However, he did not condemn his wife and took the situation calmly. Unfortunately, he was not willing to help her and simply filed for divorce. Given the problems Susan was facing, he easily obtained full custody of their children. This outcome seemed to suit her completely. She did not even attempt to challenge the court's decision. Now she was alone, without her children, and still full of a desire to have fun. Additionally, after the divorce, Susan received a substantial amount of money, which led her to throw a big party at her home, where James also appeared. Susan was almost 10 years older than James, yet he fit her interests. Their acquaintance was intensified by the use of strong illegal substances. Susan's issues escalated to such a degree that she began to believe she was hallucinating. Their meeting coincided with James's divorce, and nothing could restrain the lovers. Several months passed, and their strange relationship was marked by emotional highs and lows. Later, Susan said that she had immediately fallen in love with James and that he became the man of her dreams. He officially changed his name to Michael Bear Carson, and in 1978, they went on a trip to Europe in search of their spiritual followers. Soon, the situation only worsened, as all of Susan's savings from the divorce were spent on banned substances and entertainment. At this time, Michael was under her complete control. They believed in a fictitious religion centered around Susan, who claimed she could see those possessed by demons, distinguish witches, sorcerers, and other dangerous entities. Meanwhile, Michael became a sort of instrument for executing witches. During this period, Lynn fought to obtain full custody of Jen. Lynn succeeded, but on weekends, Jen had to visit her father and stepmother. Jen found herself in a poorly organized home. She was only 4 years old at the time, later recalled entering the house to find it nearly empty, with many trees planted in pots throughout the interior. She described it as a kind of magic forest, as the house held little more than a single water bed for sleeping. From her later memories, weekends at her father's house felt like a horror movie. She did not like Susan, whom she described as a villain from a cartoon. It seemed that her father and stepmother were ignoring her existence. Jen instinctively felt that women should not eat, and later she discovered that she preferred to starve all weekend rather than eat the food offered to her. Despite the difficulties Jen faced, she initially did not tell her mother about the frightening real-life stories that haunted her. Instead, her memories from her early years were often filled with something terrifying. Jen remembered well that Susan considered her possessed by demons, punished her by scratching her back, while her father blindly believed everything his beloved Susan said and supported any punishment. Jen could do nothing to resist the much stronger adults. Susan repeatedly tried to conduct some kind of exorcism rite on Jen, and during one of these sessions, Jen's body bore 5 marks resembling claw scars. When Lynn noticed these marks, she was alarmed and wondered what was happening in that house. She tried to ask Jen about it, but because of her young age, it was difficult for the girl to explain. Nevertheless, Lynn still sensed that something was wrong. It became clear to her that James's transformation into Michael was not an accidental event. In marriage, he had become much more aggressive. Lynn now believed that her daughter was in danger. Attempts to reach James were futile, as he was completely under Susan's influence. Contrary to the court's decision, Lynn took her daughter and ran away with her. Until that moment, they had lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and now they had moved to California. Lynn did not tell anyone their new address because she feared that if her actions were revealed, Jen would be taken away and that she would lose any opportunity to see her. She felt that Jen would not survive to enter school. Lynn did not want to contact law enforcement at all, knowing how slowly the system worked. Realizing that anything could happen during an investigation, she decided not to waste time. Lynn had to quit her job, and they lived very poorly after the escape, relying on random earnings. This escape became the second significant event in Jen's life. The first was the sudden divorce of her parents, which she never understood because her mother and father had once seemed to love each other. As she grew older, she supported Lynn's actions. Her mother explained that her father was sick, and they just needed to stay away from him to avoid being infected. In reality, James and Susan's way of life became eccentric, spending money on substances while neither worked. They decided to move to California, possibly because, during a moment of clarity, Michael wanted to reclaim his daughter, or maybe he thought things would be better there. They had no idea where they could find Jen and Lynn after moving. After days of wandering, Susan and Michael settled in San Francisco, where they met a girl named Karen Barnes, who was then 23 years old. Karen dreamed of becoming an actress and moved to California to try her luck in acting. Unfortunately, during this period, she met Susan and Michael, who willingly shared information about their cult. This unhealthy behavior intrigued her. The entire group ended up in a rented apartment since Susan and Michael could no longer afford housing. Karen became the first person to join this cult. She was attractive and immediately caught Michael's eye. However, he could not betray Susan behind her back, so he approached Karen openly and told her that he believed she should become his second wife. This proposition was unacceptable to Susan. She claimed to have seen the future and insisted that Karen was a witch who intended to destroy the cult and kill them both. Michael believed Susan so completely that he feared her power and obeyed her without question. Susan easily convinced him that he had to deal with Karen, making her the first victim of their cult. Michael agreed, waiting for Karen to arrive after taking a cast iron frying pan and a knife. On March 7, 1981, he hit Karen on the head to stun her and then stabbed her, inflicting 13 wounds to her face and neck in what seemed to be a ritual murder. They wrapped Karen's body in a blanket, placed her head on a pillow, and drew a series of strange symbols on the walls before leaving. Karen's dream of becoming an actress was shattered. When the door was broken down, her skull was discovered in a pool of blood, but no trace of the criminals was found, except for the drawings, which included the name Susan. The apartment had been rented by Karen, and aside from a superficial description from neighbors, there was no information about Michael and Susan. They fled, fully aware that they needed to distance themselves from the crime scene. They hitchhiked north and lived for a year in a secluded cabin in the wilderness, where no one could find them. Very little is known about this period in their lives. A year later, feeling bored, they discovered an illegal marijuana farm outside the city and decided to go there. It was quite a large illegal organization with a lot of work and a shortage of workers. Susan tended to the plants while Michael monitored the safety of the operation, and together they continued to live their typical hippie lifestyle, remaining constantly intoxicated from substances. A young man named Clark Stevens intervened in the matter. He was a 26-year-old guy, a friend of the plantation owner. Clark was well versed in growing illegal plants, but he drank a lot, and he had his own vision that contradicted Susan's opinion. Clark took the initiative, began giving advice. Susan did not like how actively Clark was interfering in their activities. It seemed as if he was too arrogant. She turned to her husband, declaring that this man was encroaching on the sacred, putting the profit of their religion below him, which was unacceptable. Susan told Michael that she had a vision in which Clark turned out to be an evil sorcerer. Naturally, this statement automatically became a death sentence for Clark. After Clark's murder, Michael obtained a gun. It is unknown where exactly it came from. In any case, he did not use it at first. He carried it with him to guard the farm. After Clark was dealt with, his body was doused with gasoline and burned. The remains were disposed of by burying them not far from this forbidden plantation in the forest. Later, the date of death was set as May 12, 1982. It is curious that this farm was located no more than a kilometer from residential buildings. In early summer of the same year, one of the families had an outdoor barbecue. They did not go deep into their yard but moved to the far part of a large plot of land. They had a large dog that they let run around. The animal went into the forest, as if attracted by something, and when it returned, the owners noticed something strange in its mouth. When the dog approached the married couple, they discovered it was carrying a part of a human skull. Naturally, the family called the police. Law enforcement officers discovered an illegal farm that had been abandoned in a hurry. No one was there, but a group of young people interviewed by the authorities told of a pair of dirty hippies who had fled the plantation quickly. They fled by hitchhiking again, disappearing into the territory of the states. On May 1983, the area around the plantation was thoroughly searched by a team that went deep into the forest, where they found Clark's burial place and a tourist backpack. Inside, they found various items, a pistol, a fake ID, and also a manifesto describing the program of a cult-like religious organization called Hunt. The most disturbing item was a list of names and surnames of so-called witches and sorcerers that included even popular figures such as Ronald Reagan, the current president of the United States, as well as the governor of the state. The police were particularly interested in two other names, Clark and Karen, who were already listed as killed. In total, the list contained 12 people, consisting of ordinary citizens. However, it turned out to be impossible to establish their fates precisely, as there was nothing specifying either addresses or phone numbers. Due to the possibility of a national security issue, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began a search. During this period of Jen's life, terrible changes began to occur. Her father, Michael, called Lynn and said that he was returning to California and intended to take Jen. Lynn did not give him the address. She was very scared because she could not even contact the police for protection. However, this did not even need to be done because just a few hours after Michael's call, FBI agents arrived at her home. The authorities already knew that Michael was actually James Carson, and Lynn was his ex-wife. Jen was the daughter whom the ex-wife had actually kidnapped. Despite this, they treated Lynn's act leniently, considering all the circumstances and the danger for Jen. The agents knew they were dealing with a very dangerous couple of criminals. In the father's desire to take Jen, they saw an opportunity to catch the killers. As far as the law enforcement officers knew at that time, Susan and Michael were hitchhiking, making it impossible to track their exact location. On May 12, 1983, in the car, a 30-year-old truck driver named John Hellier. A couple of young people who looked harmless were heading to California and picked up a other man. The only space in his car suitable for passengers was the cabin, but with 3 of them in the front, it was cramped. The hitchhikers began to settle inside when they climbed in. Michael saw this and was furious, as he perceived the contact of a mere mortal with the prophetess as a sign of disrespect. Susan supported his opinion. Michael took out other pistol, as the first one was thrown not far from the plantation. The cabin was cramped. John managed to start a fight. They fell out onto the road. Other motorists drove by, some even stopping to help, while Susan shouted to Michael that he had to finish off evil sorcerer. Realizing that a grown man could defeat her husband, Susan took a knife and approached John, stabbing the wounded driver. They run away, leaving John's body on the side of the highway in Napa County. Susan and Michael stole a truck and took off. However, witnesses reported to the police, which led to a big chase. Susan and Michael lost control and drove into a ditch. But they were not going to surrender. A shootout with the police began. The criminals managed to escape again, this time on foot. Susan and Michael then was miraculously detained after John's murder. No one was seriously hurt, and it was time for they of villains to face fair punishment. Although there was evidence that they had victimized others on the list, they were not required to confess, particularly to the murders of Karen and Clark. They could only be charged with the murder of John, as there were witnesses and irrefutable evidence. When Susan and Michael were brought in for questioning, they refused to cooperate with the police, demanded the involvement of all TV channels, press, and newspapers. They sought to turn their bloody tale into a major press conference in order to gain fame. Susan insisted that she was a clairvoyant, claiming this would allow them to attract as many followers as she wanted, specifically targeting young people who were as devoted as Michael. Naturally, law enforcement agencies did not want to give such attention to them. As the trial approached, their demands for media involvement were partially met, but not to the extent that Susan had wanted. There were several reporters in the courtroom. Susan claimed that President Reagan was a demon who needed to be killed. Law enforcement managed to extract the names of 2 victims. And Michael confessed to killing Clark, who had worked with them on a plantation of prohibited plants. He also spoke about the failed actress, Karen. Before the trial even began, everything Susan and Michael said seemed like a circus. Susan expressed absurd ideas that were later quoted in various reports. Several books were written about her prophecies, but few people took her claims seriously. Among Susan's statements was the assertion that all these murders were committed in self-defense. She concluded her speech by expressing her bewilderment at why their fight against evil warranted any accusations. The forensic expert detailed the atrocities committed by Susan and Michael, making it obvious that their actions had nothing to do with self-defense or fighting demons. They themselves were pure evil. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 75 years for 3 counts of murder. It was clear that the killers should never have been released. It seemed that everything was over, but Jen's life turned into a nightmare. She accidentally learned the whole truth about her father and stepmother, which came with shocking details. Consequently, she found it impossible to trust anyone. Realizing that her own father, the man who had personally fed her breakfast every day and combed her hair, was capable of such terrible evil, she understood that evil was everywhere, impossible to escape. In her youth, she slept with scissors and a knife under her pillow, believing it the only way she could close her eyes and fall asleep. This fear eventually transformed into a fear that she herself could become a manifestation of pure evil, because the blood of murderer ran in her veins. Thoughts of what her father had done haunted her relentlessly. At the age of 10, Jen even considered taking her own life. During that difficult time, she was actively supported by her mother, stepfather, and teachers. These close figures helped her resist despair, and she chose to embrace life. As a teenager, Jen dated various guys but found it hard to hide the truth about her father. Many learned who he was and subsequently broke up with her. Eventually, Jen concocted a story that he had died in a car accident, yet the truth became unbearable over time, prompting her to confess. Ultimately, she realized she had to confront her fear head-on. At the age of 20, Jen visited prison for the first time in years to see her father. During all this time, he had sent her letters every week, but their content was bizarre. When they finally met, she did not even use the transparent barrier and phone but met him in person. Her father hugged her, and she felt choked with horror as he told absurd stories about the fortune teller Susan. Speaking as though he had last seen her only yesterday, he was completely unaware that he had been locked away for the last 15 years. As she left the visit, she realized he had not changed a bit, nor did he feel guilty. The father who had loved her simply no longer existed. After this encounter, Jen contacted the families of Michael Carson's victims and apologized on his behalf. They all responded in the same way: she was not guilty and should not suffer for her father's crimes. After this, she began to manage her traumas, but her nightmares were far from over. In 2014, a reform of the correctional system was enacted, enabling Susan and Michael to request parole every 5 years. Jen's nightmares returned once again when Michael applied for parole for the first time. Jen was on the commission, but contrary to her previous stance, she argued that he was dangerous and did not regret the crimes he committed. She insisted that if he were released, he would kill again. The next attempt for parole took place in May 2020, but James was again refused. The court ruled that he would have the next opportunity no earlier than 10 years from then, which means in May 2030, when he turns 74, he will try to get out again. The situation with Susan was somewhat different. She also applied for parole in 2015, but her request was denied. The court ruled that she would not be eligible for another opportunity for 15 years. A lawyer took up her case, believing that this was too long a period. In 2023, the defense attorney's appeal was approved, so in December 2025, another hearing will be held, and Susan will have the right to seek parole. The families of the victims of these criminals, along with Jen Carson, are waiting with bated breath for this moment, praying that the commission will make a negative decision. Jen and her mother, Lynn, are still convinced that the real number of the killer's victims is much higher than 3. Determined to make a difference, Jen decided to devote her life to helping people, particularly those who are contemplating self-harm. For this purpose, she received a doctorate in social work. Now, while helping others, she has found peace. Jen understands that she cannot atone for her father's sins nor bring innocent victims back to life. She can only live her life in a way that brings as much light to the world as possible, and she is committed to doing this. Robert Ackerman was born on May 9, 1968, in Stockton, California. From a very young age, he displayed extraordinary intelligence. Even as an infant, he amazed those around him by forming complete sentences, leaving his mother in awe as she witnessed her son's abilities unfold. His brilliance and exceptional grades during elementary school made him stand out. However, during this time, his parents' relationship began to deteriorate. Eventually, his mother, Darlene Bradshaw, decided to leave his father and take him with her in search of a fresh start. The family relocated to Visalia, a city 2 hours from Stockton. This change not only meant a new home but also a new school for the children. Even so, Robert maintained his high academic performance and continued to excel. Meanwhile, his father Kenneth, who lived alone in Stockton, became a bartender. An arrangement led to the brothers being separated for the next 8 years. Robert stayed with his father, while his younger brother, Ken, lived with their mother. Robert's father was not a man who showed affection through warm words or gestures. Instead of expressing his love with hugs or care, he chose to encourage Robert through material rewards. Every time the boy got a high score, his father would give him a gift, which made him always strive to achieve excellence in order to receive recognition from his father. Over time, this method of parenting deeply influenced Robert, instilling in him a strong desire to be recognized and rewarded for his achievements. Even though they lived far apart, Robert's younger brother, Ken, always admired his brother. Ken saw Robert as a leader and a source of inspiration. During his teenage years, Robert set a clear goal for himself: to fulfill his dream of joining the U.S. Air Force. Despite frequently changing schools, which affected his academic performance, Robert still graduated from high school at the age of 17. He then joined the U.S. Air Force and reported to Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, dedicating himself entirely to military training. While others used their free time for leisure and socializing, Robert stayed focused on his training and poured all his energy into self-improvement. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. He became a role model for others struggling to stay motivated and committed to their goals. Robert's determination and abilities earned him significant recognition, and he exceeded the high expectations placed upon him. After 2 years, Robert earned a bachelor's degree while simultaneously studying in the medical field. Having served actively in the Air Force and receiving an honorable discharge in 1988, he continued serving in the reserves until 1993. At the age of 25, he enrolled at Golden Gate University in San Francisco to pursue a master's degree in business administration. He had ambitious plans and envisioned working for another 10 years before retiring at 35. After completing his master's degree, Robert accepted a position with Roadway Trucking, located in San Bernardino County, northwest of Los Angeles. Advent was well known for its convenient location and high reputation. Robert quickly distinguished himself as an outstanding employee in his division. Within 2 years, his boss recommended him for a promotion to efficiency expert. In this role, his job is to evaluate the company's operational performance and improve service quality from end to end. Although Robert enjoyed his job, he felt the financial compensation was inadequate. His boss paid him $40,000 a year, but he felt that this was 20% less than he deserved. Despite some disappointment, he was determined to develop his career with confidence. His parents were immensely proud of his accomplishments, and his brother, Ken, also found success, managing a bar and purchasing a cattle ranch. Their father showed his support by inviting both sons home for a special gathering, where he gifted Robert a cherished family heirloom, a diamond ring he had saved since he was 16. This heartfelt gesture reflected not only his deep love but also his unwavering belief in Robert's ability to achieve all his dreams. By 1994, Robert had always lived according to societal standards and norms. However, he began craving new experiences and decided to visit Las Vegas. While there, he became intrigued by the legendary Palomino Club, a historic venue for celebrities and influential figures during the 1950s and 1960s. At the club, Robert met Alla Kosova, who was originally from Moldova in the former Soviet Union. When she was 14, her family immigrated to the United States in search of a better life. In America, she discovered her passion for dancing and turned it into a profession. She eventually began working at the Palomino Club under the stage name Ecstasy. She loved her job, which provided her both personal fulfillment and financial independence. Robert was mesmerized by Alla's dancing and paid $500 for a private performance. To Alla, it was simply part of her work, and she viewed Robert as just another client. But for Robert, it meant something more. Lacking experience in relationships, he began to believe there could be a deeper connection between them. Captivated by her, he started to visit the club regularly, spending substantial amounts of money just to watch her perform. He also showered her with expensive gifts, including diamond earrings, and took her to luxurious dinners. In his mind, he considered Alla his girlfriend. In early 1995, Robert's workplace underwent restructuring, and his job was at risk. Instead of waiting for the outcome, he decided to quit and focus on developing a computer program, hoping to sell it and start his own business. Despite his financial uncertainty, he continued spending extravagantly on Alla, ignoring the mounting debts on his credit cards. Desperate to keep her in his life, he sought quick ways to earn money, but his efforts only worsened his financial troubles. In an attempt to maintain a presence in Alla's life, Robert calls her and makes up a story about being robbed in New York, thinking she would be more interested in him than material matters. However, he was mistaken. Once Alla realized there was nothing more she could gain financially from him, she severed all ties, even changing her phone number. Alla's departure left Robert deeply devastated. To make matters worse, his software project failed, leaving him without income and an uncertain future. By the summer of 1995, Robert was still struggling with depression and decided to seek help from his loved ones. His first step was reaching out to his mother, Darlene. After explaining his financial difficulties to his mother, she invited him to stay with her family at their home in Visalia, believing their support would help him recover. In early September, Robert moved into his parents' house. At that time, his younger brother Ken was employed at a motel. Upon hearing about Robert's struggles, Ken hoped to rebuild a strong bond with him and began spending more time with him. Ken greatly admired Robert and believed he could overcome any challenge. Meanwhile, Darlene had started dating a man named Art George, who was raising his son, Scott. Scott had grown up in a small community and was known for his cheerful personality and positive outlook on life. He loved water skiing and also enjoyed dancing. Ken and his girlfriend often spent time together on weekends, and Darlene hoped this would give Robert and Scott a chance to connect. Since they were of similar age, she hoped they would find common interests, which might help Robert recover from his depression. Scott turned out to be a great source of support for Robert. The two began spending time together in the evenings, boating, taking walks by the lake, and water skiing. They quickly developed a close friendship, which delighted both Darlene and Art. However, Robert couldn't stop thinking about his desire to win back his ex-girlfriend, Alla. He became convinced he needed money urgently to regain her affection. This belief led him to contemplate committing a robbery. Shockingly, the idea took hold in his mind, and for the first time, Robert, who had always followed the law, decided to obtain a firearm. In October 1995, Scott was going through a tough time. His girlfriend had just left him, and he desperately wanted someone to talk to about his pain. On October 3rd, he asked Robert to meet him at a bar. Throughout the evening, Scott talked non-stop about what was troubling him. Robert, however, only pretended to listen as his mind remained preoccupied with his own financial and relationship problems. Later that night, while the two were walking home, Robert, overwhelmed by frustration, suddenly pulled out a weapon and attacked Scott. To cover up the crime, he transported the body to a wooded area and disposed of it by throwing it into an abandoned mine shaft. When Scott failed to respond to calls and remained out of contact for several hours, his mother, Art, grew worried, as this behavior was unusual for her son. After waiting until morning, she reported Scott missing to the police. Investigators interviewed Scott's family and friends, including Robert. During questioning, Robert claimed that he and Scott had spent time at the bar before heading home. Over the next month, Robert was interrogated 3 more times. Realizing he was at risk of being arrested, he decided to act. He traded his car for a rented truck and persuaded Darlene to move with him to Medford, Oregon. After arriving in Medford, Robert and Darlene began searching for a place to live. While searching for a suitable house through real estate brokers, they got in touch with a real estate agency owned by Roxanne Ellis and Michelle Abdil. Roxanne was born on November 4, 1942, in Amarillo, Texas, to Roy Charles Wagner and Mary Cameron Wagner. She was known as compassionate and always willing to help others. She had previously been married and, in 1965, had her first child, a daughter named Lori Alice. They also had a son, though little information is available about him. In the early 1980s, she divorced her husband and decided to start fresh. She moved to Colorado with her children and soon secured a job at a prestigious medical clinic specializing in obstetrics. It was there that she met Michelle, marking a turning point in her life. Michelle was born on July 8, 1953, in Roseburg, Douglas County, Oregon, to George Abdil and Ninette Jins. Her parents raised her with love and care. According to her relatives, she grew up to be kind, optimistic, intelligent, and energetic. She brought joy to those around her. After starting her job at the clinic, Michelle developed a close friendship with Roxanne. Over time, this bond grew stronger and eventually led to their engagement. However, their relationship faced disapproval from the residents of Colorado Springs, who were opposed to same-sex relationships. After much thought, they decided to move to Medford with Lori, as Michelle's mother had recently opened a real estate agency there. Although some friends had warned them that Medford was even more conservative than Colorado Springs, they thought that the atmosphere of a small town, where everyone knows each other, would promote friendly and supportive relationships. Michelle and Roxanne quickly earned the respect of Medford residents with their dedication and strong principles. They were soon elected to the city church council. Wasting no time, they renovated an old house they had purchased, transforming it into a beautiful home. Later, when Lori had her first daughter, they embraced their roles as loving grandmothers while continuing to manage the real estate agency, creating a warm and welcoming environment for their clients. When Robert approached Roxanne looking for housing, she offered him a free house in the Sheridan Court complex. However, they couldn't come to an agreement, and Robert and his mother rented a different house. This brief interaction, however, planted a dark idea in Robert's mind. On December 4, 1995, Robert contacted Roxanne again, requesting to see the house she had previously shown him. He didn't identify himself, and Roxanne didn't ask for his name. The agency usually kept records of appointments, but this time Roxanne only recorded the time and place of the meeting. Around 11 a.m. that day, she arrived at the specified location and found Robert waiting for her. Once inside the house, Robert pulled out a weapon he had recently purchased and began threatening her, demanding a $50,000 check. He tied her up but soon realized his plan wouldn't work since the check required Michelle's signature for approval. Frustrated, Robert pressured Roxanne to call Michelle and lie, claiming her car battery was dead, to lure Michelle there. His plan worked. When Michelle arrived, Robert ambushed her and tied her up with tape, just as he had done with Roxanne. Unable to obtain the money, he forced them into a car and took them to a garage. There, he made them get into Roxanne's silver pickup truck and attacked them with a silenced gun, killing them instantly. He then placed their bodies in the trunk of a Toyota. Acting quickly, Robert drove to a location linked to a house that Roxanne had recently shown to a client. Meanwhile, Lori noticed her mother Roxanne's car parked near the property, but as she approached, the driver sped off, raising her suspicions. Concerned, Lori followed the car, determined to find her mother. The car eventually stopped, and as Lori got out of her vehicle to investigate, Robert restarted his car and sped away, leaving her alone and filled with worry. Lori returned to the parking lot and found Michelle's car. Michelle's belongings were still inside, but there was no sign of her, which terrified Lori. Realizing something was seriously wrong, she immediately reported the situation to the police. Just 5 meters from where the car containing the bodies was abandoned, Robert returned home to his mother. That evening, detectives visited the rental property and inspected Roxanne's car at the scene. However, they found no evidence of violence, no blood, biological traces, signs of a struggle, or any indication of what had happened to Roxanne and Michelle. Neighbors reported seeing a strange man entering and leaving the vacant property that night. They described him to the police, who used the information to create a composite sketch that was later published in newspapers and aired on television. Worried that his crime might soon be exposed, Robert told his mother he had found a job in Los Angeles and would be leaving shortly. The disappearance of Roxanne and Michelle was solved on December 7th. A cable repair worker noticed a thick, reddish liquid dripping from under the chassis of a pickup truck. Curious, he approached to investigate and found the bodies of the 2 women in the trunk, partially concealed by cardboard boxes. Shocked by the discovery, he immediately reported the incident to the police. When the police arrived at the scene and conducted their investigation, they found that the repairman closely matched the sketch of the suspect. He was promptly arrested. Upon searching the vehicle, detectives concluded robbery was unlikely, as nothing valuable was missing. Blood tests confirmed that Roxanne and Michelle had been shot inside the truck, and 4 bullet casings were found. No fingerprints were found, but male footprints were spotted near the scene. Forensic analysis revealed green polyester fibers around the wounds, indicating that the shooter used a blanket or similar material to muffle the gunshots. Additionally, Roxanne had a cut on her leg from tape used to tie her up. Using this evidence, investigators pieced together the sequence of incidents from Roxanne's home to the garage and, ultimately, to the truck. Believing fingerprints might still be present on the tape, investigators examined it using infrared light and chemicals. They successfully retrieved 2 clear prints, which did not match the detained electrician, clearing him of suspicion. While one team investigated the crime scene, another traced phone calls made to Roxanne. The calls were linked to the Tiki Lodge Motel. However, issues with the motel's phone records made it impossible to determine the exact room or caller. With 30 occupied rooms, most paid for in cash by transient guests, identifying the perpetrator became an exceptionally difficult task. At that time, Darlene, Robert's mother, began to worry that her son might be involved in the murder that had shocked the public. Her fears were confirmed when she saw a composite sketch of the suspect on television, which left her horrified. Choosing to fulfill her civic duty, Darlene decided not to shield her son and contacted the police. She provided her address, which was near the location where the car in question had been found, and informed authorities that Robert had left for California. Investigators began running a background check on Robert but found no immediate signs of trouble. However, upon reviewing his purchases, they uncovered a link to the Tiki Lodge Motel. This discovery prompted detectives to alert California authorities, noting that Robert had previously been questioned in connection with another disappearance. As the investigation progressed, Robert attempted to evade capture, aware that he was being followed. He moved from town to town, from Wythe to Stockton, to stay ahead of the authorities. However, Oregon Police Lieutenant Tim Doney kept a close eye on his credit card transactions. His most recent transaction was eventually traced to a motel. At the same time, Kenneth, Robert's father and Darlene's ex-husband, also decided to cooperate with the police to assist in finding their son. On December 13th, Kenneth called the police to report that he had seen Robert in the city. Working alongside special forces, the authorities launched an operation to arrest Robert. They found him in a motel room in Stockton. During the raid, officers confiscated Robert's sports bag, which contained a stun gun, handcuffs, a roll of tape, and a pistol equipped with a homemade silencer. Blood traces were discovered inside the pistol barrel and were sent for forensic analysis. During his initial interrogation, Robert admitted to the crime without showing any remorse. He claimed that his original plan was to rob the victims, but everything went wrong. He confessed to murdering Scott, explaining that he wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. Investigators were shocked by Robert's attitude and lack of regret. He even mocked the victims, only expressing regret about being caught. DNA testing later confirmed that the blood found in the barrel of the pistol belonged to Roxanne and Michelle. Robert's fingerprints matched those found on the tape, and his shoe prints matched those found at the crime scene. Based on this evidence, Robert was charged with aggravated murder, first-degree kidnapping, and robbery. He was held in San Quintin jail while awaiting trial. On December 18th, during a conversation with his father, Kenneth, Robert revealed where Scott's body had been disposed of. Kenneth passed this information to the police, who then located Scott's remains at the indicated site. The discovery devastated Scott's family, who had endured prolonged uncertainty. For those who knew Robert, his transformation from a smart, successful man to someone capable of such terrible crimes was deeply unsettling. Investigators sought to gather more details about his personality as they prepared to extradite him to Oregon for the trial in the Roxanne case. By January 1996, while imprisoned in Medford, Robert suddenly changed his stance and claimed he was innocent. His defense team filed a motion to overturn the death penalty in Oregon. However, several months later, on September 11, 1996, Robert again pleaded guilty to the murders of Roxanne and Michelle, which were committed with particular cruelty, as well as to charges of kidnapping and robbery. The investigation determined that Roxanne and Michelle had died under aggravated circumstances. Robert was sentenced to an additional 6 months in prison for kidnapping and robbery. A separate trial regarding related charges was held on September 23, 1997. During the trial, it was revealed that Robert had committed the murders with extreme cruelty, driven by his desire to continue robbing and killing others to sustain his lifestyle and support Allah. The prosecution argued that the death penalty was necessary. During the defense, Robert's lawyer described him as a man in anguish, trying to find meaning in life after significant losses, sparking heated debate about the application of the death penalty as well as the potential for human rehabilitation and redemption. On October 27, 1997, the jury unanimously found Robert guilty of intentionally murdering Roxanne and Michelle, deeming him a serious threat to society. The trial court concurred, sentencing him to death. He was sent to Oregon State Penitentiary. In 2002, Robert faced another trial in California for the murder of Scott George. He was found guilty and received a second death sentence. Early during his imprisonment, Robert complained about hearing voices and claimed that he had a transmitter implanted that allowed others to control him. In February 2011, an Oregon court deemed him unfit to stand trial due to his inappropriate behavior, commuting his death sentence in Oregon to life imprisonment without parole. However, his death sentence in California remained in effect, keeping him on death row. In 2018, prison staff discovered Robert dead in his cell. A forensic investigation later determined that he had died of natural causes. Robert's transformation shocked those who had known him. Once a talented boy with extraordinary intellect and a model soldier, he became a murderer who showed no regard for human life. A diamond ring, a keepsake from Robert's once successful career, was left at his father Kenneth's house after Robert lost everything and committed murder. To Kenneth, the ring served as a bittersweet reminder of a brilliant past that could never be reclaimed.
When an officer cautiously lifted the pillow covering the woman, he recoiled. She was already gone. 2 bullet wounds to the head, the blood seeping deep into the fabric beneath her. Beside her lay a man, still alive, but barely. He did not respond to their voices, nor did he open his eyes. He had also been shot in the head. The bullet had not passed through, leaving him in a critical condition, conscious but unable to speak. After several hours of resuscitation efforts, he was declared dead. The scene was eerily calm. No weapon was in sight. The room itself showed little disturbance, only a small hole in the ceiling and a dark stain spreading across the wall. The alarm system had never sounded, and the rest of the house bore no signs of forced entry or violence. Downstairs, silence hung heavy. Outside, the 2 teenagers waited. One of them was the son of the victims. He had already given his version of events, but as police soon discovered, not all of his statements matched what they had found inside. The air grew heavier. Suspicion began to take shape. Antonio Armstrong Sr. was born in Houston when his mother, Kay Winston, was just 15 years old. Shortly after, she married a man who already had 5 children from a previous relationship. Together, they built a blended family where Kay later gave birth to 3 more kids. Despite the challenges, she worked hard to treat all the children equally. Christian faith was central to their household. From an early age, Antonio showed exceptional athletic ability. After high school in Houston, he enrolled at the University of Texas, where he played football at a high level. His mother cheered him on at every game. Following college, Antonio was drafted by the Miami Dolphins before continuing his career in Canada with the BC Lions and later the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Injuries eventually ended his professional football journey, and he returned home to Houston. Antonio's life remained deeply rooted in faith. After retiring from football, he became an assistant pastor at the very church where he had grown up. It was there that he met Dawn, a devoted member of the congregation who was admired for her kindness and active involvement. On July 14, 1998, the 2 married. Together, they built not only a family but also a business, First-Class Training, a chain of gyms that eventually expanded to 3 locations across Houston. Antonio also began a YouTube channel where he shared motivational messages. Before marrying Antonio, Dawn had a son named Josh. He was outgoing, kind, and athletic. Antonio legally adopted Josh, raising him as his own son, who was now registered as Josh Armstrong. Antonio and Dawn later welcomed 2 more children, Antonio Jr., known as AJ, and their youngest, a daughter named Kyra. AJ grew up calm, disciplined, and physically active. From a young age, his parents encouraged him in sports, and he thrived on his high school football team, following in his father's footsteps. His upbringing emphasized structure, faith, and hard work. Though Josh and AJ were stepbrothers, they always referred to one another simply as brothers. Kyra, the youngest, grew up in a secure and stable environment, enjoying the benefits of the family's growing success. By 2016, Dawn and Antonio were living with their two youngest children, AJ and Kara, in a home on Palmetto Street in Houston. Their oldest son, Josh, then 20, had recently moved out, renting a place just 2 minutes away. He was attending the Art Institute of Houston, pursuing a future in music. AJ, at 16, there was a high school student preparing for advanced placement courses. While 12-year-old Kyra had just begun middle school, all three children maintained close ties with their grandmother, Kay, visiting her several times each week. To outsiders, the Armstrongs appeared to be the very definition of a successful, close-knit family. Faith was at the heart of the Armstrong household. This family is very active in church. At home, discipline and structure guided daily life. Dawn was meticulous in keeping routines, monitoring homework, enforcing curfews, organizing meals, and managing free time. Every child has chores, and being late, hiding things, or skipping school is not acceptable. Antonio emphasized academics and athletics, believing sports instilled discipline and character. In his early school years, AJ had been polite, diligent, and well-behaved. But as he grew older, cracks began to show: missed assignments, tardiness, and small disciplinary issues. Josh, the older brother, began visiting less frequently, and his conversations with his siblings grew sparse. Although Dawn and Antonio never openly distinguished between their biological and stepchildren, their relationship with Josh became more and more distant over time. He longed for independence. Kyra, the youngest, was her mother's focus. Dawn parented with both strictness and care, monitoring her daughter's academics, friendships, and even digital life. She and Antonio also regularly checked their children's phones, read messages, and track locations. Any suspicion of disobedience led to consequences. Dawn kept detailed notes on AJ's behavior in her phone and often discussed strategies with Antonio about how to handle him. The Armstrong household ran under near total parental oversight. After discovering Antonio and Dawn in their upstairs bedroom, investigators began a thorough sweep of the house, with particular focus on signs of forced entry. They found no signs of forced entry. The windows were locked, the glass intact, and the doors showed no evidence of tampering. The home security system, linked to Dawn's cell phone, recorded every arming, disarming, and/or activity. On the night of the crime, the system was armed at 12:52 a.m. and disarmed at 1:40 a.m. The exact moment a call was placed to 911. During that interval, no doors or windows had been opened. Investigators concluded that only someone inside the house, or someone with the alarm code, could have disabled the system. There were no reports of visitors that night, and no spare keys were unaccounted for. On the first floor, a kitchen drawer, where a Smith & Wesson .22 caliber handgun was normally stored, was pulled completely open, but empty. The weapon was later recovered in a downstairs closet near the staircase. Beside it was a torn piece of paper with a message scrawled in French. "I've been watching you for a long time. Follow me." The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, and the sheet bore no fingerprints or identifying marks. Investigators could not determine its origin. In AJ's third-floor bedroom, officers also noticed a strange mark on the ceiling, a bullet hole that appeared to have been fired upward at close range. The angle and trajectory suggested an odd scenario, but the bullet itself was never recovered, leaving yet another unanswered question. The Armstrong home was outfitted with a modern security system, including motion sensors that tracked movement between floors. According to the system's log, after 1:24 a.m., the only activity recorded came from the second floor near the parents' bedroom. No movement was detected on the third floor, where the children's rooms were located. This directly conflicted with AJ's account. He claimed that after hearing gunshots, he went downstairs to investigate. The system showed no such movement. Kyra, AJ's sister, showed police her room and explained that she had been startled awake by a loud noise, but chose to remain in bed, never opening her door or leaving her room. To eliminate the possibility of an outside intruder, investigators brought in a K9 unit to detect any unfamiliar scent trails. The dogs found no foreign human scent leading from any entrance of the house. All confirmed movement remained inside the residence. Investigators noted that the gap between the last logged activity and the system being shut off was less than 15 minutes. In that narrow window, an intruder would have had to break in, commit the murders, and leave without tripping alarms or leaving a trace, an almost impossible feat. For detectives, this suggested that if the system had been deactivated, it was done from the inside. The following day, 16-year-old Antonio A.J. Armstrong Jr. was brought to the police station for questioning because he was a minor. His grandmother, Kay, was present throughout the interview. The recorded footage from that session would later become a pivotal part of the case. From the start, AJ's demeanor raised red flags. Without being accused of anything, he repeated the phrase, "I didn't do it," 19 times. His tone was calm, almost detached, and he often seemed distracted, glossing over critical details. Officers noted that, at no point, did he ask about his parents' condition or express concern for their well-being. During a second interview, his demeanor didn't change. He showed no signs of shock, never asked to call relatives, and didn't bring up funeral arrangements. To investigators, his lack of emotional response stood out. It wasn't the reaction they expected from a teenager who had just lost both parents in a brutal attack. Although AJ wasn't arrested at that stage, he quickly became the focal point of the investigation. Detectives began looking deeper into his behavior, his circle of friends, and possible tensions within the family. Over time, cracks began to appear in the perfect son image. AJ's grades had slipped, and he had started hiding things from his parents. Investigators uncovered that he was secretly maintaining a second phone, which he used to communicate with a girlfriend his parents disapproved of. Dawn Armstrong had tried to monitor his behavior, blocking apps and limiting his access to her. But AJ found ways around it. When police searched AJ's room after the murders, they discovered a marijuana wrapper hidden in his underwear drawer. On his phone, they found text messages discussing banned substances, photos of homemade joints, and chats about buying it. These discoveries painted a far more complicated picture of AJ. One, his parents either hadn't fully realized or had chosen to overlook. A few months before the tragedy, an incident with his father's car foreshadowed the growing strain within the Armstrong household. While his parents were away, AJ took Antonio's white Infiniti without permission. The car was later discovered damaged, the wheel and frame bent after striking a curb. The repair bill was steep, but the family chose to keep the matter private. Antonio confronted his son in a serious conversation, and the episode left him considering drastic options: either transferring AJ to a different school or sending him to live with his grandmother, Kay. In hopes that stricter discipline might restore order, tensions in the household escalated in the weeks that followed. AJ increasingly viewed the rigid rules at home as suffocating. His mother, Dawn, monitored nearly every aspect of his daily life, from academics to social interactions. In private conversations with friends, AJ described the environment as controlling and invasive. The more restrictions mounted, the greater his frustration grew. Josh Armstrong, AJ's older half-brother, lived a very different life. At 20, he was no longer in the home, but only minutes away in a rental apartment. His years in college were turbulent, marked by cycles of dropping out, re-enrolling, and struggling to find stability. Behind closed doors, Josh battled anxiety, depression, and episodes of paranoia. Medical records revealed that he experienced hallucinations, panic attacks, and spells of emotional detachment from reality. One psychiatric evaluation even noted his obsessive fear that electronic devices were monitoring him. His doctors diagnosed a severe mental health disorder requiring consistent medication. 2 months before the murders, Josh was involved in a disturbing incident at the Armstrong family home. According to reports, he set fire to a blanket near the entrance of the house. The blaze was quickly extinguished before causing serious damage, but it deeply alarmed his family. Dawn immediately took him to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation, and doctors prescribed antipsychotic medication, yet no one followed up to ensure that he was taking it. Both Kara and their grandmother later recalled seeing Josh lingering near the home in the weeks afterward, acting strangely and avoiding conversation. Despite this alarming behavior, Josh was largely overlooked in the investigation that followed the murders. He was never formally questioned in the days immediately after the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA samples, and no official verification of his whereabouts that night were ever collected. To the defense, this became a glaring oversight. A young man with a history of instability, recent violent behavior, and close proximity to the home was never treated as a suspect, or even as a key witness. Kay, the Armstrongs' grandmother, later told investigators that on the day of the murders, Josh seemed detached and unresponsive. He sat silently in a chair, staring blankly at the wall, offering little more than short, evasive answers when spoken to. His medical history included past episodes of aggression and end his own life ideation. Twice, he had been placed under outpatient psychiatric observation, with doctors recommending constant supervision and treatment. Each time, however, the communication with medical professionals stopped shortly after his release. To this day, questions linger over whether Josh's proximity, medical history, and prior fire-setting incident should have made him a focus of inquiry. Investigators placed nearly all their attention on AJ. 7 years later, the prosecution unveiled what they claimed was a critical piece of evidence implicating AJ, a single drop of blood, identified as Antonio Sr.'s, found on a t-shirt collected from the crime scene in 2016. AJ's clothing had been collected on the day of the murders, sealed in a transparent evidence bag, and logged according to protocol. At the time, officers conducted a visual inspection and recorded no traces of blood. For years, the bag sat in storage, untouched and untested. Only in 2023, just months before a third trial was set to begin, did an officer reviewing the file claim to have noticed a suspicious discoloration beneath the label on the t-shirt packaging. When re-examined under laboratory conditions, a small, reddish-brown stain was indeed discovered beneath the evidence tag, pressed against the fabric near the collar. Forensic testing confirmed the presence of DNA matching Antonio Armstrong Sr. The drop was minuscule, barely 2 millimeters in size, yet it instantly became the prosecution's most powerful weapon. The defense questioned the reliability of the evidence. They pointed out that this important piece of evidence had been overlooked for 7 years, even though investigators, forensic experts, and lawyers had examined it multiple times. Its location was also strange. The bloodstain was underneath a factory tag that seemed undisturbed, with sharp edges and undamaged glue. Records showed the evidence bag hadn't been opened since 2016. For the stain to be under the tag, it would have had to be there from the start. If that were the case, how could everyone who previously inspected the evidence have missed it? Suspicion spread quickly. AJ's attorneys suggested the possibility of contamination, or worse, evidence tampering. After 2 mistrials, they argued, the state's case had grown thin, and just as a third trial loomed, a mysterious new discovery emerged. They demanded an independent review of the evidence and full access to the storage facility's chain of custody records. The records themselves raised further questions. In the years following the crime, AJ's clothing and other items had been shuffled between departments, with responsibility for storage changing hands multiple times. Prosecutors dismissed this as a clerical oversight, insisting the evidence had remained secure. But doubt lingered. The blood's location also sparked heated debate. It was found inside the shirt, near the collar, positioned in a way that suggested close proximity to the victim when the fatal shot was fired. The state argued this placed AJ at the scene of Antonio's murder. The defense countered that no forensic analysis could conclusively explain how or when the trace had landed there. To them, the mystery surrounding the stain was more damning to the prosecution's credibility than to AJ himself. Despite these uncertainties, the bloodstain became the centerpiece of the case. For the prosecution, it was the long-awaited breakthrough. For the defense, it symbolized systemic failure, The Armstrong case soon grew into one of the longest and most polarizing criminal proceedings in Houston history. Over nearly a decade, 3 separate trials unfolded, each drawing national media coverage and sparking fierce public debate about evidence, justice, and the fallibility of the system itself. The first trial began in 2019, 3 years after Antonio and Dawn's deaths. Prosecutors argued that the killings could only have been committed from inside the house, and that AJ was the only person with both access and opportunity. Yet the defense dismantled much of this narrative. The murder weapon bore no fingerprints. AJ's clothing showed no blood at the time, and investigators had failed to fully probe the potential involvement of Josh, his mentally unstable half-brother. After weeks of testimony, the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. The case ended in a mistrial. The second trial took place in 2022. Both sides relied on largely the same evidence, though with slightly different emphases. Prosecutors focused more heavily on AJ's seemingly irrational behavior, appealing to the jury's emotions. The defense repeated its argument that the investigation had been one-sided and that AJ's older brother, Josh, who had reportedly struggled with mental health issues, was overlooked as a potential suspect. Once again, the jury could not reach a unanimous decision, and the proceedings ended in a second mistrial. The third trial was held in August 2023. By that time, prosecutors introduced what they described as a critical new piece of evidence, a minuscule blood stain found on AJ's t-shirt. Though the shirt had been collected in 2016, the stain was only identified years later when forensic testing was repeated with updated methods. This finding became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors argued that the presence of the blood indicated AJ was in close proximity to his father at the time of the shooting. They also cited data from the home's alarm system and motion detectors, insisting no intruder could have committed the crime without disabling the system from inside. The defense countered by accusing investigators of mishandling or even manipulating the evidence. Despite the ongoing disputes, the jury returned a guilty verdict. After 7 years and 3 trials, AJ, whose real name is Antonio Armstrong Jr., was convicted of murdering his parents and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Under the United States criminal justice system, a conviction requires proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, a fundamental principle of American law. Reasonable doubt means that if jurors have any justifiable uncertainty about the defendant's guilt, they are obliged to acquit. In AJ's case, many observers argued that this standard was not met. No direct evidence tied him to the crime. The murder weapon, his father's gun, contained no fingerprints from AJ. There were no signs of a struggle, and the blood stain on his shirt, though pivotal to the verdict, had not been reported until 7 years after the murders. Much of the prosecution's case rested on AJ's behavior following the incident and on statements that prosecutors described as inconsistent. Investigators also overlooked potentially important details. Not all biological evidence from the home was tested. No fingerprint analysis was carried out on the doors, and the windows were not examined for microscopic traces that might suggest forced entry. Portions of the alarm system's log were missing or corrupted, and no independent forensic audit was ever conducted on the system. Josh, AJ's brother, was never called to testify, and his alibi was never formally verified. He was never treated as a suspect, though no official explanation was given for this decision. A note found near Dawn Armstrong's body was never subjected to handwriting or DNA analysis, nor was it used to expand the scope of the investigation. Across all 3 trials, the evidence remained essentially the same. No new suspects were investigated, and no fresh lines of inquiry were pursued. Instead, jurors were repeatedly asked to interpret AJ's demeanor and behavior. Emotional framing often took the place of concrete proof. Ultimately, the guilty verdict rested more on interpretation than on irrefutable facts. The principle of reasonable doubt is designed to prevent wrongful convictions when evidence is uncertain. In Antonio's case, guilt was never definitively established. Yet the court decided to conclude the case instead of admitting that simply having doubts doesn't prove someone is innocent or guilty. Following his conviction, AJ did not remain silent. From prison, he gave multiple interviews to journalists and independent creators, Reflecting on the case and his family, while continuing to assert his innocence, he described his home life as complicated but never abusive. He admitted to normal teenage clashes with his parents over discipline and rules, but stressed that he admired his father and leaned on his mother for guidance. AJ insists that he loves his parents and insists that he could never kill them. One of the main themes in AJ's statements is his sharp criticism of the investigation. He claims detectives targeted him from the very beginning, ignoring other possibilities. AJ has said he still hopes for a future appeal and is prepared to fight for his name. No matter how long it takes, he believes justice can only be served if the case is re-examined without bias and with the help of independent experts. In one interview, AJ made a striking comment. If his father had survived, he would have revealed the truth. AJ believes Antonio Sr. would have defended him, stood by his side, and prevented the family from being torn apart. To AJ, that belief feels like his last plea for trust. Kate met AJ after his arrest. Their relationship began during the investigation, and she knew exactly what she was stepping into. Despite the accusations, she believed he was innocent. They started by writing letters, later seeing each other during supervised visits, and eventually they got married. Their marriage was legally registered while AJ was still awaiting trial. A year later, they had a son. Kate now raises him on her own. His only connection to his father is through photographs, brief phone calls, and short video messages from prison. Kate says her life is built around waiting for court hearings, for paperwork, for appeals. Her daily routine is a balancing act of working, raising their son, responding to the media, and preparing legal documents. In interviews, she insists she doesn't allow herself to get tired. In her words, if she gives up, AJ will remain trapped in the system forever. Her faith is what keeps both him and their family going, but the pressure has always been there. Public opinion is divided, and Kate has received hostile messages accusing her of blind loyalty or defending a killer. Still, she remains certain that the truth will come out. For her, the only real danger is doing nothing. She refuses to see herself as a victim. Instead, she believes her role is to ensure this story does not end in silence. What if AJ really didn't pull the trigger? If so, then who entered the house, bypassed the alarm system, ignored the children, and fired the fatal shots? Or was that person already inside? On the night of February 3, 2003, at the House of Blues in Los Angeles, Lana Clarkson met Phil Spector, the legendary music producer who was once praised as a genius with Wall of Sound and an icon of an entire era. That seemingly harmless encounter opened a chain of horrifying events. Just a few hours later, in the luxurious Pyrenees Castle Villa, Lana was found dead. A gunshot through the mouth ended her life. Outside, Phil trembled as he walked out the door, whispering that he thought he had killed someone. From a chance moment one night, the fates of both of them turned in two opposite directions. One lost his life. The other fell from the peak of legend straight into the abyss of crime. How could a fleeting encounter turn into a tragedy that shocked Hollywood? To fully understand that tragedy, we need to go back to the beginning, to the life of Lana Clarkson, a girl with an artistic dream, stepping into the glamorous but also pitfall-filled lights of Hollywood. Lana Clarkson was born on April 5, 1962, in Long Beach, a coastal city in Southern California. She was the daughter of Donna and James Clarkson and grew up with two siblings, Jesse and Fawn. She spent her childhood in Sonoma County, known for its rolling hills, meadows, and vineyards at the heart of California's wine country. Surrounded by nature, she enjoyed small-town warmth while dreaming big. Tragedy struck early when she lost her father, a loss that weighed heavily on the family. Christmas 1978 was particularly traumatic, and soon after, her family moved to Los Angeles. By then, Lana had finished high school and her passion for the arts was clear. She wanted a life on stage and screen. Tall, striking, and charismatic, Lana seemed destined for entertainment. Nearly 6 feet tall, with long legs, blonde hair, and clear eyes. She had a presence that drew people in. Friends described her as adventurous, warm, and free-spirited. By the early 1980 seconds, Lana was determined to build a career in acting and modeling. She began with small roles in television and film, often as an extra. It was a humble start, but one she believed in. During this time, she also volunteered. In 1982, she joined Project Angel Food, an act of courage during a time of heavy discrimination. Helping others was as much a part of her identity as acting. Lana made her official acting debut in 1982 with a small speaking role in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, an iconic coming-of-age comedy. In 1983, she appeared briefly in Scarface, sharing a scene with Michelle Pfeiffer, a highlight for any aspiring actress. That same year, she starred in Deathstalker, a fantasy film that later gained a cult following. In 1985, Lana landed the role that defined her career, Amethea in Barbarian Queen, a fierce warrior who embodied both strength and sensuality. The film became a cult classic, and her performance made her a recognizable figure among fans of fantasy and B-movies. She went on to appear in projects like the sci-fi film Blind Date, directed by Nico Masterakis, and had smaller roles in Amazon, Women on the Moon, 1987, beyond film. She worked in television, commercials, and modeling, including campaigns for major brands like Mercedes-Benz. Her career took her across the United States and abroad to Japan, Greece, Argentina, Italy, Switzerland, France, Jamaica, and Mexico. Despite her talent and dedication, her career plateaued. She didn't achieve mainstream stardom, but she built a loyal fan base. Comic conventions kept her in the spotlight, where fans, many of whom first knew her as the Barbarian Queen, lined up for autographs and photos. She became an icon in her own right, leaving a lasting impression on a generation of fans. By the late 1990 seconds, Lana looked for new ways to connect with her audience. She launched her own website, sold autographed digital versatile disc, and engaged with fans on a message board. This provided income and a sense of community and appreciation. As Lana entered her 40 segundo, Hollywood became tougher. Roles dwindled, auditions led nowhere, and full-time acting was no longer sustainable. In January 2003, she took a part-time job as a hostess at the House of Blues in Los Angeles, a club known for live music and celebrity guests. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept her close to the entertainment world she loved. Her job was to welcome and care for high-profile guests, ensuring they felt at home in the VIP areas. On the night of February 3, 2003, Lana went to work as usual, unaware that this ordinary shift would mark the beginning of a tragedy. That evening, legendary record producer Phil Spector, one of the most famous figures in music, walked into the House of Blues. What started out as a seemingly harmless encounter quickly led to one of Hollywood's darkest tragedies. To understand how, we need to look at Phil Spector's past. His real name was Harvey Philip Spector, born on December 26, 1939, and raised in the Bronx, New York, in a Russian Jewish family. At the age of 9, Phil's life took a turn. On April 20, 1949, his father locked himself in a running car and died of carbon monoxide poisoning. The loss left a lasting wound. In 1953, his mother moved the family to Los Angeles, looking for a fresh start. By 19, Phil was in college and meeting others who shared his passion for music. He formed a group called the Teddy Bears, serving as guitarist and songwriter. He wrote, "To know him is to love him," inspired by words on his father's tombstone. Released in 1958, the song became a surprise hit, reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 by December. The success didn't last. The Teddy Bears recorded more songs, but none matched their debut. By 1959, the group dissolved, and Phil withdrew for a time. He later returned to music, not as a performer, but as a producer. In the studio, he found his true calling. He partnered with two producers at a small label, Junior Records, but his ambition grew. In October 1962, he bought out his partners, took control, and founded Phillies Records. Under Phil's, he produced 21 singles, sold over 13 million copies, and earned 9 gold records. By age 21, Phil was a millionaire, worth more than $2 million, and a major force in American music. However, his talent also came with a dark side. Early in his producing career, he collaborated with stars like Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison. His knack for crafting hits quickly made him one of the industry's brightest young talents. The turning point came in 1963, when he introduced the Ronettes, sisters Ronnie and Estelle Bennett, and their cousin Nedra Talley, formerly known as the Darling Sisters. They underwent a complete transformation under Phil's leadership, both in image and sound, becoming one of the most recognizable acts of the 1,960 seconds. Phil also unveiled his signature innovation, the wall of sound. This technique layered multiple instruments and vocals to create a dense, orchestral texture that filled the recording space. It sounded unlike anything before. Big, immersive, and unmistakable. Cementing his reputation as a studio pioneer, many credit him with reshaping how popular music is produced and recorded. Over the years, Phil worked with the Ramones, Tina Turner, Cher, John Lennon, and George Harrison. John and George, both former Beatles, brought him in to rework unfinished material from the Get Back sessions, songs that would become part of the album Let It Be. Having Phil on a project signaled prestige, but it came at a cost. Behind the fame was a darker side. He could be volatile, controlling, and dangerous. Partners later described him as abusive and manipulative, often carrying a gun to intimidate them. That behavior extended to the studio. Members of the Ramones said he once pulled a gun and fired shots during a session. Even John was shaken when Phil fired into the ceiling while they were recording. Phil's personal life was also troubled. He married twice and adopted 3 children, who later accused him of isolating them and forcing them into disturbing, inapropiate scenarios. He also had more children with another woman he never married. By the early 2010s, Phil's reputation mixed genius with chaos. He was hailed as a legend, but widely distrusted. On February 3, 2003, he went to the House of Blues in Los Angeles, where Lana Clarkson was working as a hostess. He arrived intoxicated with another woman. As Lana approached, she didn't recognize Phil right away. Some say she even mistook him for a woman, an insult to a man obsessed with power and recognition. Realizing her mistake, Lana tried to make amends and gave him extra attention. Despite the busy night, other accounts say she recognized him right away and was attentive because she thought he could help her career. Near closing, Phil invited Lana to his mansion for a drink. She agreed. His driver, Adriano de Souza, drove them to his 33-room hilltop estate, Pyrenees Castle. Arriving around 3 o'clock a.m., Lana and Phil went inside. Adriano, who spoke little English, waited in the car as instructed. Around 5 o'clock a.m., Adriano heard a sharp sound he believed was a gunshot. A few minutes later, Phil appeared at the door, unsteady and holding a pistol. According to Adriano, Phil said he thought he had killed someone. Panicked, Adriano called 911. When police arrived, they found Phil drunk, erratic, and refusing commands. After several tense minutes, officers entered the house and discovered Lana Clarkson dead, slumped in a white chair with blood on the fabric. She had been shot in the mouth. A gun lay near her left ankle. Phil immediately began changing his story. Although he had told Adriano he thought he had killed someone, he now claimed Lana had put the gun in her own mouth. He said at times it was an accident, that she kissed the gun and it went off, or that she intended to harm herself. None of these claims matched the evidence. Police arrested him. A search of the mansion found 8 additional guns and blood traces in a bathroom. The next day, February 4, 2003, Phil posted a $1 million bail. For a man of his wealth, it was easy, and he remained free for more than 6 years as the case moved through the courts. In 2006, a married Rachel Relly Short, someone close to him who knew his personal life well. Some believe the marriage was a strategy to prevent her from testifying against him. But the case proceeded anyway. The first trial began in March 2007. Phil Spector was charged with second-degree murder, but in September the jury deadlocked, and the judge declared a mistrial. He was retried in October 2008. This time, the proceedings were televised and drew national attention. In court, Phil was erratic. He changed lawyers several times, argued with his defense team, and made unusual statements. He claimed Lana had harmed herself, said he took medication for schizophrenia, despite not being diagnosed, described himself as bipolar, and spoke of battling inner demons. As the trial continued, disturbing details from Phil's past emerged. One of his sons called him a psychopath. Phil's sons recall that at age 12, he and his brother were blindfolded and forced into unstable situations orchestrated by their father. 5 other women also testified with similar accounts, saying that Phil forced them into intimacy and threatened them with a gun. 2 had reported him to police at the time, but later withdrew their complaints. Alcohol was a factor in every incident. The most damning testimony came from his driver, Adriano, who consistently stated that Phil walked out of his mansion with a gun and said he thought he had killed someone. After 9 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Prosecutors portrayed Phil as a dangerous man who played Russian roulette with women's lives. On May 29, 2009, Phil Spector was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life in prison. Without the possibility of parole, he showed no emotion as the verdict was read. A reporter described him as motionless, expressionless, and silent. Even in prison, he drew attention. He requested a divorce from Rochelle, accusing her in a letter of spending his $35 million fortune on luxury cars, designer clothes, and lavish trips. The divorce never happened, but the accusations made headlines. He also maintained his eccentric image, giving interviews to newspapers and magazines and posing in oversized sunglasses and wigs. On January 16, 2021, Phil died at the age of 81. He was taken from prison to the hospital after experiencing respiratory problems, but doctors were unable to save his life. Years earlier, in 2013, HBO released a 92-minute film about his life. With Al Pacino portraying Phil, the case remains one of Hollywood's most publicized, fueled by Phil Spector's fame and the shocking violence surrounding Lana Clarkson's death. For many who knew him, the outcome was no surprise. They had seen his dangerous side long before the tragedy at the Pyrenees Castle. Still, there was a lingering sadness that someone once celebrated as a groundbreaking music innovator ended his life defined not by genius, but by darkness, destruction, and a permanently tarnished legacy.
Viktor Tarkov was one of the most prominent figures in Samara's elite. His name was well known across all social circles, from government officials to influential figures in the criminal underworld. More than just the city's leader, he controlled a significant portion of its economy. He rose from being a Soviet-era chemical engineer to a successful businessman, eventually becoming a high-ranking official and ultimately the mayor of Samara. This position increased his power but also caused him to face many dangerous enemies. Viktor's family is not only wealthy but also considered a prosperous dynasty thanks to their power and lavish lifestyle. Viktor owned opulent estates, extensive land holdings, and a collection of luxury cars, all while ensuring his family enjoyed the privileges of his position. However, beneath their prosperity lay a series of hidden problems. Ekaterina, Viktor's granddaughter, was born in 1995 in Samara. She was raised in a wealthy and influential family, where affluence and power were commonplace. Her mother, Ludmila, had always been raised as the heir to a powerful lineage, while her father, Sergei Loganov, carried a shadowy reputation and was known by the nickname Lord. From an early age, Ludmila was attracted to questionable groups. Despite having access to the finest education and numerous advantages provided by her father, Victor, she chose to lead an extravagant and carefree lifestyle. By the 1990s, Ludmila had fully immersed herself in the underground world, associating with influential members of organized crime, where she felt completely at ease. Her first husband, Konstantin Sherbakov, was connected to a notorious gang in Samara but was killed in 2001. After his death, Ludmila became involved with Sergei, who was not only a figure in the criminal world but also a key player in large-scale oil fraud schemes worth millions. In 2010, Sergei was arrested for allegedly masterminding an attack on a federal agent, an act that ultimately led to his imprisonment. Despite this, Ludmila continued down the wrong path. She became increasingly involved in organized crime, engaged in fraudulent activities, and eventually found herself in legal trouble. In the summer of 2021, she became the focus of a highly publicized case. She attempted to blackmail Alexander Maliev, a regional parliament deputy, by threatening to reveal damaging personal information unless he paid her a large sum of money. However, her plan failed when Alexander reported the incident to the authorities. In December 2022, she was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 7 years in a general regime correctional facility. Meanwhile, Ekaterina had a childhood filled with freedom and little supervision. As the granddaughter of Victor, a powerful political figure, she had never faced financial hardship and lacked an understanding of the true value of money. Unlike her peers, she had no limits on her spending and was not subject to academic or disciplinary pressures. This absence of rules fostered a sense of entitlement that only grew stronger over time. From an early age, Ekaterina lived a life of luxury, drawn to high-end fashion, exclusive parties, and influential social circles. At the time, Samara's nightlife scene was thriving, and she quickly became part of the city's elite youth, mingling with the children of wealthy families for whom extravagance was a way of life. In this environment, alcohol and illegal substances were readily accessible. Ekaterina never worried about her future because her maternal grandfather, Victor, provided for all her needs, while her mother, preoccupied with her own criminal activities, paid little attention to her. Trouble began when Ekaterina became heavily addicted to illegal substances, which drastically affected her behavior. She became more and more dependent on them and had difficulty living normally without them. Her social circle also changed, and she began to associate with people who were willing to provide her with illegal substances in exchange for money, favors, or influence. Despite her grandfather's financial support, her reckless spending habits soon exceeded the allowance she received. By 2016, Ekaterina's reputation in Samara had already been tarnished when she met an Israeli man during a trip to Cyprus. Their relationship progressed quickly, culminating in marriage. She adopted his surname, becoming Ekaterina Belskaya, and in 2017, they welcomed a son. However, married life did little to curb her destructive behavior. She continued her partying, heavy drinking, and emotional outbursts. Eventually, her husband reached his limit and, after 2 years, filed for divorce. Then, Ekaterina returned to Samara and left her son in the care of his grandparents. Back home, her family continued to support her. Her maternal grandfather, Victor, provided financial aid despite her conduct, but even his generosity could not keep up with her lifestyle. Ekaterina's spending spiraled further out of control, with much of her money going toward parties and illegal substances. By 2020, her financial situation had become dire, as the funds from her family started to dwindle. She attempted rehabilitation but quickly relapsed, resuming her destructive habits. Her behavior became increasingly erratic, and though she continued to maintain expensive tastes, she no longer had the means to sustain them. In desperation, she began selling her possessions, designer handbags, jewelry, phones, and even religious icons gifted by her grandparents. By that point, family heirlooms held no sentimental value for her. Her only focus was obtaining cash. Over time, Ekaterina began borrowing money from friends and acquaintances, but people quickly lost faith in her and refused to lend her more. Her debts piled up, and creditors became relentless in their demands for repayment. With no legal income and no intention of finding a job, she became stuck in an unrelenting cycle of debt. Seeing that his granddaughter had no desire to change, Victor decided to reduce her financial support. However, she saw this not as an act of tough love but as a betrayal. She firmly believed he was obligated to provide for her. Family tensions grew worse, escalating into outright hostility. She openly expressed her resentment, blaming her grandparents for all her problems. Her hatred grew, and she finally came to a cold decision. The only way to completely solve her financial problems was to eliminate those who stood in the way of her inheritance. By 2023, Ekaterina's financial situation had reached a critical point. Her debts had grown significantly. She had borrowed from numerous sources, including friends, high-interest lenders, and even individuals known for their harsh collection methods. Despite promising her creditors that she would repay them soon, she had no means to do so. The pressure mounted as creditors became increasingly aggressive, bombarding her with persistent calls and threats. Desperate for money, Ekaterina began attempting to sell her family's valuables. She sought buyers for antique religious icons, jewelry, and even her grandmother's car. According to investigators, she managed to sell some of these items, but the funds were still insufficient. Her desperation led her to consider selling real estate under her maternal grandfather Victor's name. However, her maternal grandfather, being a cautious and experienced man, maintained strict control over his assets and refused to grant her access to his properties. Ekaterina realized that, as long as he was alive, she would never gain full control of his wealth. In early January 2025, Victor and his wife, Natalia, suddenly stopped responding to calls. Concerned, their relatives, friends, and business associates made repeated attempts to contact them, but their phones remained switched off. Their abrupt silence was troubling, especially since Victor had a reputation for staying in touch, even with former colleagues and business partners. When he failed to respond to birthday wishes on January 3, 2025, those close to him grew increasingly worried. The first person to raise the alarm was Victor's former deputy. After several unsuccessful attempts to call Victor, he suddenly received a strange text message, "All questions for KI." This message raised suspicions, as Victor was known for his proper grammar and precise communication, which were noticeably absent in the message. Continued attempts to contact Victor and Natalia were unsuccessful, prompting Victor's assistant to file a missing persons report with the authorities. Once the report was filed, the police promptly launched an investigation. Detectives searched Victor's home, reviewed recent financial transactions, and examined surveillance footage. Disturbing details quickly emerged, particularly regarding Ekaterina's suspicious behavior. Investigators uncovered unusual financial activity in the days leading up to Victor and Natalia's disappearance. Ekaterina had made strange purchases and appeared to have tried to erase all traces of them from the apartment. When investigators inspected Victor's home, they discovered an unsettling scene. Although there were no obvious signs of a struggle, the residence was eerily spotless. Forensic specialists detected traces of chemical cleaners commonly used to destroy biological evidence. Using advanced equipment, they conducted a thorough examination of the apartment and uncovered hidden biological traces in the bathroom and kitchen. Laboratory tests revealed the presence of blood, which DNA analysis confirmed belonged to Victor and Natalia. The small quantities of blood indicated that the cause of death likely did not involve heavy blood loss. Investigators focused on the suspicious purchases Ekaterina had made in the weeks prior to Victor and Natalia's disappearance. Transaction records revealed she had bought plastic containers, chemical substances, heavy-duty bags, and protective suits online, items with no apparent use in an ordinary household. These purchases were particularly notable given her precarious financial situation and inconsistent spending habits. Further inquiries revealed that Ekaterina had also begun rapidly selling off her grandparents' possessions. The assets, including antique religious icons, jewelry, and her grandmother Natalia's Toyota RAV4 were all put up for sale. The speed of these transactions raised alarms, especially since there was no evidence that the rightful owners had willingly ceded control of their property. Meanwhile, law enforcement analyzed Victor and Natalia's phone records and discovered that their devices had remained active after their disappearance. Text messages sent from their numbers to friends and family claimed they had left town. However, linguistic analysis revealed inconsistencies in the writing style, strongly suggesting that someone else was using their phones. Another critical discovery involved Ekaterina's access to her maternal grandfather Victor's online banking account. Investigators found multiple attempts to execute financial transactions using Victor's accounts after his disappearance. Although she failed to fully access the funds, her attempts to use his accounts while his whereabouts were unknown became a key piece of evidence. Once the authorities had gathered sufficient evidence, they arrested Ekaterina at Victor's apartment, where she had been living since his disappearance. During her arrest, she remained unusually calm, showing no resistance, no shock, and no questions about the reasons for her detention. Her lack of visible distress was striking, given the gravity of the situation and the serious accusations against her. After being taken to the police station, Ekaterina was interrogated. During the initial questioning, she refused to provide testimony, claiming she felt unwell. Investigators continued their work and presented her with the evidence they had collected. Instead of providing a consistent explanation, she changed her version of the incident, making contradictory statements. As the investigation progressed, new evidence emerged that helped reconstruct a timeline of the crime. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage, witness statements, and digital traces from her phone and computer, which provided a clearer understanding of what might have occurred. Ekaterina's main defense was to deny any involvement altogether. She claimed that she knew nothing about her grandparents' whereabouts and accused her of selling their belongings at their request. However, the evidence told a different story. Investigators continued piecing together the incident, gathering more incriminating evidence against her. Although the exact sequence of the incident remains uncertain, several theories have been explored. One theory suggests that Ekaterina planned the crime in advance, possibly by adding a toxic substance to her grandparents' food or drink. This may explain why there was no struggle and very little blood was found in the apartment. However, forensic testing has not yet confirmed the use of poison. Another possibility is that Victor and Natalia were quickly attacked, potentially with blows to the head. The limited blood at the scene suggests the crime could have been carried out in this manner. A quick and forceful attack may have caused instant fatal injuries, followed by an attempt to conceal the remains. Strangulation is also considered a plausible scenario. If the perpetrator wanted to avoid drawing attention, this method would make sense. However, investigators have yet to present sufficient evidence to substantiate this theory. After committing the crime, Ekaterina is believed to have taken extreme measures to dispose of the remains. Surveillance footage captured her bringing a large blue plastic barrel into the apartment, which was later seen outside the building. Investigators suspect it was used to transport Victor and Natalia's remains. Chemical substances were also discovered, which may have been used to accelerate decomposition. Some media reports claim that human remains were found in the apartment's refrigerator, though officials have not confirmed this. Despite intensive cleaning efforts, forensic specialists detected microscopic traces of blood throughout the apartment. As the investigation progressed, each new piece of evidence further substantiated the theory that Ekaterina was directly involved in the disappearance, and likely the deaths, of her grandparents, Victor and Natalia. One peculiar detail stood out. Shortly before the incident, Ekaterina claimed to have broken her leg and was seen walking with crutches. Yet, on the day she was spotted carrying bags in a barrel, the crutches had disappeared, and she appeared to walk without difficulty. Neighbors also reported seeing an unidentified man near her at the time. It is believed he may have helped her move the container, but his identity remains unknown, and authorities are still attempting to confirm his involvement. Investigators suspect that Ekaterina disposed of the remains in pieces, scattering them in dumpsters across various parts of Samara. The garbage collected from these locations was later transported to the Privalza landfill. The authorities have launched a search at the dump, but it has been challenging due to the amount of time that has passed and the vast quantity of garbage, amounting to tens of tons. Alternatively, some body parts might have been destroyed by chemicals or other methods. However, there is currently no concrete evidence to support this hypothesis. After completing their investigation and reviewing all collected evidence, prosecutors formally charged Ekaterina. She was accused of a double murder and of desecrating the remains, with the alleged motive being to seize her grandparents' assets. The trial attracted significant public attention, not only because the suspect, Ekaterina, was the granddaughter of a former mayor but also due to the heinous nature of the crime. After her arrest for killing her grandparents, investigators considered whether her mother, Ludmila, might have been involved. A reasonable question arose: could Ludmila, despite being in prison, have influenced her daughter or had a motive for the murders? However, no concrete evidence linked her to the crime. At the time of the incident, Ludmila had already been incarcerated for several years and lacked the means to orchestrate it. Nevertheless, her influence on Ekaterina's mindset was undeniable. From a young age, Ludmila had instilled in Ekaterina the belief that power and wealth could be achieved through deceit, manipulation, and crime, a worldview that ultimately shaped Ekaterina's actions. The prosecutors claimed that Ekaterina had committed the crime with a high level of cruelty and financial motives, and they proposed a life imprisonment sentence for her actions. A critical question during the trial was whether Ekaterina acted alone. Investigators theorized that such a complicated crime might have required an accomplice. Their primary suspect was a man named Vitaly, an inmate Ekaterina had met while visiting her mother in prison. Evidence uncovered that she had maintained frequent contact with Vitaly. Phone records revealed she called him often before the crime and even transferred money to his account. Despite these findings, no direct evidence linked him to the murders. Although the court considered the possibility that he had participated in coordinating the actions, the evidence was not strong enough to convict him. At the time of her sentencing, Ekaterina's case became one of the most shocking criminal stories in recent years. Public opinion has clearly mixed opinions. Some viewed her as a cold and calculating criminal who acted out of greed, while others suggested she may have been manipulated by more powerful forces. Regardless of these differing perspectives, most agreed that the crime was horrific and deserved the harshest punishment. Currently, the trial is ongoing and aired on national television. Meanwhile, journalists have uncovered new details about Ekaterina's troubled life, including her struggles with substance abuse and significant debts. The public was stunned to learn that the granddaughter of a prominent figure could commit such a brutal act against her own family for financial gain. Recent reports reveal that Ekaterina has stopped speaking, likely due to severe psychological stress. During interrogations and court hearings, she has remained silent and appears emotionally detached. Experts have speculated that she may be suffering from mutism, a condition in which a person loses the ability to speak, or a stupor-like state, indicating impaired consciousness while retaining basic physical reflexes. In the coming days, Ekaterina is scheduled to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at the Samara Psychiatric Hospital to determine her mental state and rule out the possibility of feigned symptoms. This assessment is expected to last at least 30 days. Following the murder of Victor and Natalia, questions about their inheritance arose. Preliminary estimates assessed the value of Victor's property at about $54 million. However, Ekaterina was disinherited because the law prohibits individuals who commit crimes against the deceased from inheriting. This leaves only one potential heir, Ekaterina's young son, who was placed in the care of social services after her arrest. The boy's father, an Israeli citizen, learned of the situation through news reports. Although the court is considering granting him custody, Russian authorities have not yet finalized their decision. In the meantime, Victor's estate remains unresolved, as Ekaterina has been disqualified from the inheritance. The ownership of the property awaits the court's decision to determine the rightful heir. As of February 19, 2025, Ekaterina's trial has not yet concluded, and no verdict has been issued. She remains in custody until at least April 2, 2025. Investigators are still examining the possible involvement of other individuals, including Vitaly, an inmate with whom Ekaterina had been in contact. However, no concrete evidence has been found linking him to the crime. According to Ekaterina's attorney, she continues to refuse to speak and has not commented on the charges against her. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Risa Trexler. Losing a loved one is terrifying, especially when the person is young. It is even worse to be under unfounded suspicion. Everyone around you, including your own mother, begins to suspect that the weapon of the crime was in your hands. Risa Trexler was born on October 11, 1968, in the small town of Salisbury, North Carolina, USA, with a population of about 30,000 people. She was the eldest child in the family, and after 2 years, she had a sister named Jody. Risa was described as a smart and kind girl with a heart of gold who was always ready to lend a helping hand to those in need. She was positive and cheerful. It was no surprise that her younger sister looked up to her. This admiration was quite logical since they even shared a room in the family house. Naturally, there were occasional misunderstandings and quarrels typical for girls of the same age, but overall, the strong connection they shared was enviable. On June 15, 1984, 15-year-old Risa and her 13-year-old sister Jody decided to invite friends over to celebrate the beginning of their school holidays. Among their guests were 2 friends, who lived nearby. When the teenagers gathered at Risa's house, they made sandwiches, snacked, listened to music, watched TV, and chatted. Around 3 p.m., the guests went home. Risa decided to visit her grandparents who lived nearby. They were all very friendly, and the houses were closely situated. Risa arrived at the home of her grandparents, but found that no one was there. At that moment, her grandfather had gone to the supermarket to buy groceries, and her grandmother had gone to the hairdresser. This did not upset Risa. She had a key to the house and could let herself in. She went inside and began to watch TV. Jody did not accompany her older sister but stayed at home to finish her tasks. After about 20 minutes, Jody was about to go to her grandparents' house but immediately noticed that her grandparents' car was not there and decided to return home. She assumed that everyone had gone about their business and that there was nothing to do there. Later, around 5 p.m., the grandpa returned home first, while Grandma was delayed at the beauty salon and was expected to arrive shortly. As soon as he entered the house, he saw signs of a struggle, things were scattered around, and suspected that a robbery might have occurred. However, what he found in the room was far more terrifying and caused him to scream. Jody heard her grandfather's scream from the neighboring house, recognized his voice, and ran over to his home. She tried to understand what was happening, but her grandfather did not let her in. A commotion ensued as neighbors and relatives gathered. Finally, Jody managed to break into the house, where she found a robe lying on the floor in the guest bedroom. It was covered with a blanket to prevent anyone from seeing the horrifying sight. Risa was naked, with only a bracelet, a watch, and a ring on her body. She had suffered several stab wounds to her upper chest and neck. When the police arrived, they discovered signs of a break-in, but nothing valuable appeared to have been stolen. The fact that the perpetrator did not intend to rob was indicated by the victim still wearing her jewelry. The criminal's intentions were clearly much more sinister. Relatives who lived nearby arrived at the family home and were shocked by the horrific bloody sight. They were all concerned with only one question: what happened to Risa? Numerous theories emerged: a maniac on the loose. The body of Risa was sent for a forensic examination in North Carolina. It was revealed that she had received 18 stab wounds, primarily to the upper body. Additionally, clear signs of strangulation were found on her neck. A steak knife was likely used in the attack. The violence was so extreme that the blade had broken off and remained lodged in Risa's shoulder. The injuries were severe, with one stab wound nearly severing her spinal cord. This meant that even if she had survived, she would likely have been paralyzed for the rest of her life. Numerous defensive wounds indicated that the victim had fought back vigorously. Given that the body was found naked, abuse assault was suspected, and this suspicion was confirmed when male biological fluids were found on her body, which were collected for examination. The criminal was careless, as DNA samples, specifically skin from the killer obtained during the struggle, were found on Risa's neck, along with several hairs. Unfortunately, there were no hair follicles on these samples that would allow for full identification. However, the forensic scientist managed to establish that the dark, coarse hairs belonged to an African-American man. At that time, there was no fully developed technology for compiling a DNA profile, so while the materials were valuable, they were not needed and were simply sent to an archive for safekeeping. Jody turned out to be one of the few people who had seen Risa alive before her death. This was confirmed by familiar boys who left the house just before Risa went to her grandparents' home. Jody missed her sister, eventually decided to go to her grandparents' house as well. When she approached the house, she realized that there were no cars belonging to her relatives, which meant they had both left. She did not check if her sister was there. The house seemed empty, and it was quiet, so Jody immediately headed back home. She assumed that her sister had either left with their grandparents or had gone home herself, and that they had simply missed each other on the way. Jody later heard her grandfather scream. When she looked out from her bedroom window, she saw her grandfather crying and screaming, clenching his fists in horror. Jody immediately ran to her grandfather's house to understand what was happening. No one from Risa's immediate circle could remember any dark-skinned acquaintances capable of such brutality. However, when questioning local residents, it was possible to indirectly confirm the presence of a suspicious African American near the crime scene. 9 people reported similar stories, stating that after the alleged murder, a middle-aged black man ran through the area, appearing scared. No one raised the alarm because they did not hear the girl's screams. He managed to commit the abuse without making noise. While there were some discrepancies in the neighbors' descriptions of the stranger, overall, the account seemed credible. Despite the clear evidence indicating that Risa was attacked by an African American, detectives began searching for suspects without targeting anyone specific at first. After the attack occurred, Jody became a suspect despite the absurdity of such speculation. It was evident that a man was behind this crime. The local community was shocked by Risa's murder, which led to the spread of disturbing rumors. Information surfaced suggesting that Jody could be the criminal, and these rumors became firmly established, while the detectives did little to refute them. Although Jody was not actually a suspect, the growing suspicion from the public weighed heavily on her. During the funeral for Risa, the rumors about Jody intensified. Many believed she was too insensitive for such a tragic event. From that moment on, even investigators began to pay more attention to her. Despite her young age of 13, investigators interrogated Jody without her parents present. The girl was pressured repeatedly and was asked why she had killed her sister. Jody, in tears, protested and insisted that she could never do such a thing to the person she loved more than anyone in the world. Nevertheless, DNA samples were taken from her. Amid the pressure from law enforcement, even Jody's mother began to doubt her daughter's innocence. Gradually, her loved ones began to turn away from her, which was a devastating blow during such a difficult time. The police were unable to find any leads against the other suspects on the list. The detectives could not connect the bloody massacre to anyone. Consequently, the FBI was brought in to assist with the investigation. After creating a psychological profile, a suspect was identified, but contrary to expectations, the profile did not match actual investigative findings. At this time, it was believed that the suspect was a white man between the ages of 18 and 24 who must have known his victim. The man probably felt remorse after the crime and searched for a way out of the situation, indicating he was emotionally unstable. 5 months passed since the brutal murder. The investigation reached a dead end. Finally, Jody's grandfather, Walt Monroe, spoke publicly against the local police, stating that the authorities were not making enough efforts to solve his granddaughter's murder. Months turned into years, and those affected were tormented by uncertainty as they desperately sought to uncover the criminal's identity. Unfortunately, their efforts were in vain. During this time, Jody suffered the most. Even 4 years later, rumors of her involvement in her sister's murder persisted and worsened. These rumors spread to social media, infiltrated the media, and even led to the creation of dedicated groups that vilified her as the killer. Gradually, the public's interest waned, and the case of Risa Trexler ended up archived among unsolved crimes. It wasn't until 2018, 34 years after her sister's murder, that Jodi appeared on a television show to prove her innocence. As an adult, she continued to suffer the consequences of baseless rumors. In an effort to clear her name, she requested to take a polygraph test. Shockingly, it turned out that the police had never conducted one, even though Jodi had persistently asked for it to be done. By this time, Jodi was already a married woman. However, she still remembered well the mutilated body of her sister covered in blood. Jodi, even more than the rest of the family, wanted to find the killer. Not only did the criminal kill her beloved sister, but Jodi was also shocked when all her loved ones began to turn away from her. It all started with the condemnation from strangers, gradual pressure, and attacks grew into something more. Her mother even to her, saying that she wanted to know the truth and would not be angry. This ultimately destroyed Jodi, and she even had moments when she didn't want to live. According to her, all these accusations were absurd and traumatic. To prove her innocence once and for all, Jodi went on the Dr. Phil show and passed a lie detector test to prove her innocence. She spoke in detail about her memories of that fateful day. According to her, when she ran up to the house, her grandfather did not let her inside until the last moment. Jodi believed something terrible had happened to her grandmother. When she finally entered her grandparents' house, she saw Risa's robe and a sheet, which by that time was completely soaked in blood. She didn't know who did it, but she thought her grandfather had covered his granddaughter's body to shield others from the horror. Jodi continued to express her bewilderment, stating that she had no idea why everyone was against her. She thought it was either malicious intent or the negligence and suspicion of law enforcement officers. She still didn't understand why the police showed such an interest in a 13-year-old girl. Jodi had provided all possible DNA samples and was questioned more than any other suspects, even more than the rest of the family after the murder. Some of her friends immediately turned away from her and refused to communicate. The situation worsened as rumors spread. Jodi returned from school almost every day in tears, desperately wishing for the criminal to be found as soon as possible. Little did she suspect that she would suffer for more than a decade amidst this overwhelming pressure. By the time she reached high school, Jodi began to experience behavioral problems. She even ended up in a rehabilitation center at the age of 15 because she abused alcohol and marijuana. This behavior helped her escape and distract herself from the problematic attitudes surrounding her. Allegedly, even if she did not kill her sister, she must have known much more than she actually told the detectives because she was nearby at the time of the crime. The polygraph confirmed that Jodi was telling the truth when she answered that she did not kill her sister, and there is absolutely no other information about the massacre. Interestingly, Jodi's desire to speak out after so many years triggered a new wave of interest in the murder of Risa Trexler. In November 2018, a young detective named Travis Schulenberger decided to revisit the case files and re-examine the evidence from 34 years ago. He was inspired by Jodi's courage in deciding to take a polygraph test live on the program. When Travis's efforts became known to Jodi's family, they even thanked him personally, as she was still haunted by the thought that Risa's murder remained unpunished. It was a great success that all the evidence collected in the case remained intact. Finally, on December 3, 2019, the Salisbury Police Department announced that they had information regarding the previously unsolved case. A press conference was held with the participation of the Trexler family. The event began with the announcement that Jodi was completely acquitted. The police had identified the murderer of Risa. It turned out to be a dark-skinned man from the past, Curtis Blair. According to Travis, Salisbury police detectives had done a commendable job investigating the unsolved case. They conducted repeated interrogations, spoke to everyone involved in the initial investigation, and gathered statements about a black man who had been seen running through the area shortly after the murder. They analyzed all the objects and evidence collected during the search for the criminal and began collaboration with forensic laboratories. Gradually, the authorities recognized the need to use genetic genealogy, a technique that had emerged a few years prior to the investigation of this crime, proving itself to be an advanced and highly effective technology. The resulting profile was compiled using publicly available databases, which included not only those associated exclusively with law enforcement but also independent databases where individuals could voluntarily contribute their DNA profiles. Authorities once again turned to the public for new information, particularly to learn more about the alleged killer. Simultaneously, tests were conducted in the laboratory, and a publication about the case of Risa Trexler appeared. Several concerned individuals contacted the police station, but they were unable to provide any valuable information, as everything was already known. As law enforcement agencies in the United States increasingly utilize genetic genealogy to find criminals, the public has raised more questions. Many expressed concern that such practices could be considered violations of privacy. Most databases where individuals can submit DNA samples for analysis and database replenishment cooperate openly with the police. Against this backdrop, many do not agree with the practices of such companies. To maintain privacy, the name of the criminal was initially kept secret. It is difficult to convey in words how similar Jodi lacked care at that time. Despite identifying the criminal and successfully passing a polygraph test, she still felt pressure, and some people continued not to believe her. However, the press conference, during which the district attorney firmly stated that none of Trexler family members were the killers, provided some reassurance. Before the case of Risa Trexler was reopened, about 100 potential suspects had been identified. To reconstruct the profile of the killer, biological samples collected from the deceased's body were uploaded to a publicly available genetic database. Specialists from a company conducted reverse engineering of the genealogical tree of the suspect, which allowed them to calculate several probable killers. This group was eventually narrowed down to one individual. The Parabon Nanolabs company created his profile using innovative genealogical analysis techniques, leading to the identification of a criminal who had committed another violent crime and served time in the early 2000s. However, he died of heart failure in 2007 in California. Curtis's grave is located in the Memorial Park Cemetery in Salisbury. The only evidence Blair left at the scene was a small knife that was confiscated by investigators. They managed to obtain it and send it to the crime lab. It was believed that the criminal took the second weapon from the execution site. In June 2019, investigators exhumed his body, collecting materials for DNA examination in comparison with existing criminal profiles. By August 6, 2019, it was found that Curtis Blair's DNA profile was almost 100% consistent with the killer's profile, eliminating the risk of error. The probability of a random match was too low to doubt. The evidence was convincing enough to conclude that the case was finally solved. Consequently, the case was closed, leaving the Trexler family with mixed feelings. They understood that the individual who had harmed Risa was no longer a threat and society could feel secure. On the other hand, they wondered if they would ever understand why he had committed such a terrible act. Risa's killer lived 2 hours away from Trexler House and worked in Frito-Lay factory just 2 blocks from the site of the attack. His name was Curtis Blair, a black man who was 40 years old at the time of the murder. He matched the initial descriptions provided by witnesses. He was large and strong. Born in San Diego County, California, little is known about his life. However, rumors suggest that his father was very cruel, leading to an extremely challenging upbringing. As a young man, he decided to relocate and began a journey through several states in search of a better life. At the time of the brutal crime, he already had a criminal history that included a significant prison term for assault with a deadly weapon. The stabbing incident began as the culmination of a robbery involving 2 men. For this crime, Curtis was sentenced to a long prison term. After he was released, he moved to a new place 2 years prior to the attack on Risa. During this time, he concealed his dark nature for a while. He hid from his bloody past in San Diego and then made a fatal decision to move to North Shaver. The Risa Trexler case, after more than 35 years in the dark, finally found light thanks to Jodi's persistence and significant advances in investigative technology. The identification of Curtis Blair as the killer not only completely exonerated Jodi, who had endured the pain of losing her sister and unjust suspicion for decades, but also brought a measure of justice to the Trexler family. Although Blair passed away and could not face trial, the revelation of the truth still provided a precious consolation, closing a painful chapter in Salisbury's history. For Jody, this journey was not only a fight to prove her innocence but also an affirmation of her undying love for her sister, a feeling that transcended both time and injustice. However, the question of why still lingers in the minds of those left behind. What drove Blair, a person who once lived right in the heart of the community, to so cruelly attack an innocent young girl like Risa? His true motives will likely remain a mystery, buried with him in a grave in Salisbury Cemetery. Above all, this case is a testament to the power of science and the human determination to find the truth, no matter how long it takes. For the Trexler family and the Salisbury community, the resolution of the case is not just the end of a nightmare but the beginning of a healing process, a journey they have long awaited to begin. Hello everyone, today we will learn about another case. The case of Caroline Crouch. This case brings us to Glyka Nera, a coastal town near central Athens in Greece. Caroline Crouch's parents moved to Greece from England when she was 8 years old, and they lived there for all the following years. At the age of 15, Caroline met her future husband, Bobish, in the town of Alonissos, where her parents had settled. Bobish's parents had a summer house for recreation, which he often visited. Although he was 14 years older, Caroline and Bobish eventually started dating and then living together. In 2019, they got married. Bobish was successful and respected. He held the position of helicopter pilot, and Caroline was studying at the university, hoping to enter the School of Public Catering. Caroline, 20, lived there with her 34-year-old husband, Bobish Anagnostopoulos, and her black belt in boxing. She loved animals and got herself a husky puppy when he was only 2 months old. Caroline named the dog Roxy and devoted a lot of time to the pet. In addition to the puppy, there were 4 more cats. A few weeks after their wedding, Caroline found out she was pregnant. Unfortunately, after only 3 months, her pregnancy was interrupted. However, there were no complications. After that, she was able to conceive again and gave birth to a beautiful girl, whom her parents named Lydia. Caroline's world revolved around Lydia. Everyone who knew her said that motherhood was absolutely everything to her. On May 11, 2021, the police received a call from a house in Glyka Nera, which turned out to be the home of Caroline and Bobish. The officers were told a story so horrifying that even the oldest and most experienced detectives were in complete shock. When the police arrived at the house in question, they were confronted with a horrific scene. Caroline was severely injured, and little Lydia was screaming and trying to wake her mother up. Tragically, Caroline was lying on the bed and was already dead. Her husband, Bobish, was tied up and handcuffed, with his eyes taped shut. Bobish told the police that a gang of robbers had broken into the house early in the morning while everyone was asleep. One of the gang members put a gun to little Lydia's head and demanded to know where the hidden money was. Bobish indicated where the money was and begged them not to hurt the child. Caroline, who practiced boxing, tried to resist, but several people immediately immobilized her. The leader of the gang personally strangled her, taking all the cash and jewelry. The bandits left, having tied up Bobish and taped his mouth and eyes. As a result, he lost consciousness. When Bobish came to his senses, he managed to find a phone through a small gap in the tape over his eyes using his nose. He dialed the last number in the call log, which was a neighbor's number. When the neighbor picked up, heard muffled sounds and moaning, realizing the situation, the neighbor rushed to Bobish's house, helped him call the police, and recalled later that he had heard some sounds from the neighboring house but did not attach any importance to them. When the police began to inspect the house, they established that more than £10,000 in cash had been stolen, as well as jewelry worth £20,000. Bobish said the family had recently bought a plot of land and had to pay some workers. He also suggested that someone had warned the gang, or that someone within the gang must have known about the family's financial situation in advance. The brutal nature of the crime sent shockwaves throughout Greece and soon spread around the world. The police were equally horrified and commented on how rare such crimes were in their country. The public was outraged and panicked, extending a helping hand to offer support to Babiš and his family. Although there were cameras and video surveillance around the family's house, there was little usable footage, as the cameras were not working or had not been turned on during the robbery and subsequent murder. Footage from an outdoor camera captured a car driving by around the time of the robbery, but the high fence obstructed the view of the make or license plate. Unfortunately, DNA collected from beneath Caroline's fingernails was inconclusive, and there were no witnesses. The only accounts came from the neighbor and Babiš himself. This story spread through the media like wildfire, and soon the world was waiting to see who would be arrested for this terrible crime. Government officials announced a €300,000 reward 3 days after Caroline's death for information about the massacre. All shops, bars, and restaurants on the island of Alonissos closed in solidarity, as 2,000 residents mourned a woman they had accepted as their own and felt deeply insulted by the crime. During the investigation, Babiš was offered to take a test to determine what language the bandits used when they communicated with him. He was able to identify it as Albanian, but this was not certain. After reviewing 150 photographs, Babiš managed to narrow down the list of suspects to 10 people. There was an Albanian gang that had been involved in very brutal robberies, subjecting victims to torture and beatings, with similar cases occurring 6 months prior. The police intensified their efforts to find anyone connected to the gang, utilizing their findings and knowledge, as well as Babiš's list of 10 suspects. They came across one specific person described by Babiš as a broad-shouldered man, approximately 165 centimeters tall, with short blonde hair, a known brutal abuse with a history of hating women. The police began investigating potential connections between this individual and another suspect who had robbed the home of a pilot instructor in Babiš's squad 3 years ago. Additionally, the police had another suspect named Yanis, who was also reported to be working with the gang. Soon after the funeral, a resident of Georgia attracted the attention of the authorities due to possessing a fake passport. After DNA samples were taken from him, it turned out he was involved in a home invasion, but it occurred at a different location and happened 4 days before the attack on Caroline's home. Both cases were later scrutinized. Significant differences led to the Georgian resident being eliminated as a suspect when nothing linked him to Caroline's apartment. At the same time, experts expressed concern, noting that as time went on, there was less hope of finding the culprit. Police sources told local media that there was so little evidence found in the house that it seemed as if the robbers had thoroughly cleaned the crime scene and erased their tracks before leaving. Caroline's husband was frequently called to the police station, and he obediently came with a mournful expression, conscientiously answering all of the investigators' many questions. The detectives studied the chronology of those days, the work schedules of Babiš and Caroline. They sought as much information as possible about the couple and their relationship. Babiš shared much information, but the diary found in the house painted a very different picture than what him presented. In her diary, Caroline described Babiš as rude and cruel, revealing that she had been trying to leave him for a long time. Caroline first told her husband about her desire to leave in July 2020, when their daughter Lydia was born. She expressed that she had become increasingly unhappy and was searching for a new home. However, she began to doubt her decision, thinking about her daughter growing up in a single-parent family. Later, she wrote that Babiš had control over her and had installed a tracking app on her phone. When Caroline attended therapy sessions, he could hear everything discussed. The couple's family consultant, Elaine, learned from Caroline that she was looking for an apartment in central Athens for herself and Lydia, near the culinary school she dreamed of attending. Despite often visiting a family psychologist with her husband's knowledge, one day, out of the blue, Caroline received a text from Elaine asking her to stop their sessions. She believes this is from the effects of Babiš. According to entries in Caroline's diary, tensions were high, and the situation escalated quickly. One entry stated, "Today my baby turned 1 month old. It was also the day I told myself I wanted to leave. I feel terrible." Another entry read, I am thinking of leaving for my sister, but I know that I can't leave my baby. This life hurts me." They say the psychologist encouraged Caroline to trust her mother, but she replied that she didn't want to disappoint her. Prosecutors claimed the murder was entirely intentional, pointing to the cameras being turned off before the killing and the memory cards being removed as calculated coincidences. 38 days after the scene of violence and robbery, during a memorial service for Caroline, police officers approached Bobish with a request to come with them for another interrogation. Bobish begged to wait until the service ended, but he was told this matter could not wait, as someone had been detained and his identification was needed. He was advised not to call anyone and to hide his phone while following them. This was actually a set-up, as the police needed Bobish himself as a suspect. The entire situation was becoming increasingly confusing and hard to believe. Inconsistencies and discrepancies emerged. Based on Caroline's diary entries and Bobish's story, the police realized they needed to focus on him rather than looking for a gang. When analyzing data from Caroline's smartwatch, they found that she had been in a state of extreme mental or physical stress for 6 minutes around 4 a.m., leading them to conclude that she died at a different time than what Bobish claimed. Geolocation data from his phone indicated that Bobish had been walking up and down the stairs of the house for several hours, just when he claimed he was tied up by gangsters and unable to move. After 8 hours of intense questioning and reviewing all the evidence the police had gathered, Bobish finally broke down. He played the part for weeks, but now the police assert that the gang attack story was a lie and that he himself killed his wife because she threatened to leave him, then staged the crime scene. An examination of some evidence and digital data has provided clues. If the police are correct, then this crime comes down to the actions of one cruel husband. Bobish admitted that the robbery was staged. The acts committed against Caroline and her beloved dog were horrific. The police noted that when they arrived at the crime scene on May 11th, they already had suspicions about Bobish but lacked sufficient evidence. He had played a cunning game, cooperating with the press to manipulate the narrative of his grief, all while deceiving everyone. The police wondered if there was another potential motive for the murder: money. It turned out that Bobish had led a very wasteful lifestyle. Recently, they had gone on a luxurious holiday, during which they spent a large sum of money. They also bought land and designed their dream home worth £14,000. There was also information that Bobish had been involved in the transportation of banned substance, earning money for his luxurious lifestyle by transporting them via his helicopter. Caroline's father is sure that there is a lot of truth in this information, having studied the chronology of events and the data the police compiled. In Bobish's testimony, what happened in the early morning of May 11th was concerning. At some point in the evening, Caroline texted her friend that she was leaving Bobish. Data from her phone showed that she had been trying to book a hotel for herself for the next day, but she decided to spend that night at home. At 12:35 a.m., Bobish was seen at their child's crib while Caroline was upstairs texting her friend. At 1:20 a.m., Bobish took out the memory card from the CCTV camera inside the house. Then they started to quarrel over the text messages. According to this data, Caroline's pulse jumped 50% at 4:05 a.m. when Bobish smothered her with a pillow. 5 to 6 minutes later, at 4:11 a.m. the watch stopped recording her heartbeat. He placed their young daughter next to her dead mother on the bed in an attempt to create a convincing and shocking crime scene. He then threw clothes around the house to stage a robbery. At one point, he also got rid of Caroline's pet husky. The finale of his scheme was tying himself up and taping himself. Just 2 hours later, at 6 a.m., Bobish called to report a fake robbery. An expert stated that Caroline died in torment, and, with the help of her smartwatch, it became clear that she was resisting with all her might. In his speech in court, Bobish described the strangulation of his wife as a hug. He claimed that Caroline tried to move away from him while they were lying in bed, so he held her tightly. When she tried to turn face down, he continued to hold her, pressing her hard against the pillow until she stopped moving. This continued for 5 minutes. Afterward, it seemed like Bobish tried to stir her or wake her up, but it was in vain, and then he realized that it was all over. Bobish claimed that he killed Caroline to protect his daughter. According to him, his wife was cruel, verbally abusive towards both him and Lydia, and he acted in the heat of the moment. He insisted that when he killed his wife, he had no intention of lying and that all his actions were driven by the desire to protect his daughter. This statement was considered very unfair and offensive to those who knew Caroline. Lydia was her life. Caroline idolized her child and would never have allowed harm to come to her baby. Bobish Anagnostopoulos was charged with 2 serious crimes: first, murder in a completely calm mental state, and second, cruelty to animals. Additionally, he was accused of repeatedly giving false testimony, thus misleading the investigation. Although his lawyers worked to defend him and argued that the murder was committed under the influence of emotions, this should not affect the fair verdict of the court. The case has caused a public outcry and prompted protesters to march in the streets with signs and slogans declaring "No to domestic violence." On May 16, 2022, about a month after the trial began, a jury found Bobish guilty of manslaughter while in a calm state, murder of a domestic animal, false reporting, and false testimony. He was sentenced to life in prison and an additional 10 years for the execution of a domestic dog, as well as a fine of €21,000. Additionally, Bobish received another year and 6 months for misleading the authorities. Caroline's parents wanted to erase all mention of Bobish from their memory in any way they could. They began by removing the word "wife" from the tombstone on Caroline's grave. It now reads "Mother and Daughter, Caroline Crouch." They were also granted full custody of baby Lydia, while Bobish's parents were denied custody but allowed to visit their granddaughter 5 times a month. Despite everything, Bobish and Caroline's parents maintain a good relationship and work to ensure Lydia has a happy life. The Caroline Crouch case is not only a family tragedy but also a heartbreaking reminder of the reality of domestic violence hidden behind a perfect facade. More than a year after Caroline's tragic death on May 11, 2021, the sentence handed down to Bobish Anagnostopoulos has closed a painful chapter, bringing some measure of justice to her and her family, although it cannot erase the suffering they have endured. The life sentence and additional penalties not only punish Bobish's cruel actions but also send a strong message that such crimes will not be tolerated, regardless of how skillfully the perpetrators attempt to cover them up. For the Greek community and the world, this case has evoked deep sympathy and sparked a movement against domestic violence, urging people to reconsider the potential dangers in their own homes. Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case. The case of Nahir Galarza. Fernando Pastorizo, born in 1997 in Entre Rios, Argentina, is the son of Silvia Mantegazza and Gustavo Pastorizo. Despite his parents' divorce, he grew up in a loving and supportive environment, as both his mother and father maintained a strong relationship to care for him and his sister, Carla. Fernando was a joyful and kind individual who connected easily with others. He had many friends and was always willing to help those in need. Dependable, loyal, and considerate, he earned respect as a model of integrity. Nahir Galarza, born in 1998, is the daughter of Marcela Larsa, a senior police officer, and a former officer. She grew up in a family where power and authority were prioritized, which afforded her the freedom to act as she pleased. Her mother paid little attention to her daughter's interests and sometimes encouraged inappropriate behavior. In contrast, her father consistently maintained complete control over her. From a young age, Nahir became accustomed to exploiting and manipulating others to achieve her goals at any cost. At school, she was one of the most popular girls, beautiful, confident, yet often cruel to those she deemed inferior. Despite their stark differences, Fernando and Nahir entered into a relationship that ultimately ended in tragedy. They began dating as teenagers, and at first, their bond seemed like a typical youthful romance. However, the relationship quickly took a darker turn. Fernando loved Nahir with all his heart and would do anything for her. However, Nahir betrayed him, inviting other men into her home and taking advantage of his feelings, making him emotionally dependent. Despite being hurt and humiliated, Fernando endured, hoping that she would change. The more Fernando realized the toxicity of his relationship with Nahir, the more she tried to keep him by her side. Nahir controlled Fernando's phone, monitored who he was communicating with, and accused him of cheating, even though she herself continued to date other people. When he started to distance himself, she grew angry, made threats, and used her father's position as a police officer to intimidate him. On December 25, 2017, Fernando attended a nightclub with his friends. While there, he saw Nahir kissing another man. The incident occurred in front of everyone, publicly humiliating him further. Unable to ignore the betrayal, Fernando confronted her, demanding an explanation. Instead of responding calmly, Nahir lashed out at him. Her friend, Sol Martinez, even joined in, striking Fernando in the face. Nahir laughed, insulted him, and mocked him in front of the crowd. Humiliated and devastated, Fernando left the club, unaware that it would be the last night of his life. Emotionally shattered, Fernando confided in his friends about the pain he was enduring. What hurt him most wasn't just Nahir's betrayal but her cruel insults about his family, whom he dearly loved. That night, he made a decisive choice. He would end their toxic relationship once and for all. Determined to start fresh, he enrolled in a university in a different city, hoping to escape the manipulation and suffering Nahir had caused. Although cautious due to her unpredictable nature, Fernando was resolute in his plan to move on. However, Nahir refused to let go. The desire to control took over her. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him. In her mind, if Fernando couldn't belong to her, he wouldn't belong to anyone. On December 28, 2017, after days of constant arguments, Fernando finally agreed to meet Nahir one last time. She begged him, promising that she wanted only to spend one final night together before they parted ways. Unbeknownst to Fernando, this decision would prove catastrophic. For Nahir, the meeting wasn't about saying goodbye, it was a verdict. At Nahir's house, everything seemed normal. They spent several hours together and reportedly even tried to reconnect. Fernando might have hoped that they could part amicably, but in Nahir's mind, if she couldn't have him, no one could. If he left, he would be gone forever. On the morning of December 29, 2017, Fernando was preparing to leave, feeling as though he had finally freed himself from the chains that had bound him for so long. She asks him to take her to her grandmother's house. Fernando refused initially, but he eventually agreed to take her for one last ride. He got on his motorcycle, and Nahir climbed on behind him. In her pocket was a weapon that belonged to her father. Between them, an uneasy, unspoken tension lingered. Fernando and his future killer were now heading down the same road. When they reached a deserted stretch of road, Nahir tapped Fernando on the shoulder and told him to stop. Trusting her, Fernando pulled over, expecting an explanation. Instead, she pulled out the weapon and attacked him in the back. The bullet pierced through him, and he collapsed to the ground, injured and dazed. Struggling to comprehend what had just happened, Fernando attempted to move, but Nahir didn't give him a chance. She stepped closer, aimed her weapon, and attacked again from point-blank range. Fernando died there on the side of the road. After the murder, Nahir remained calm. She attempted to eliminate evidence by searching for the bullet casings. While she was trying to find a shell casing, the second casing had already rolled onto the grass, a mistake that later became key evidence against her. During this time, a passing taxi driver noticed a girl leaning over someone lying on the ground. However, he didn't stop, thinking it was insignificant. While his decision not to intervene might have changed the course of events, the truth eventually surfaced. Soon, the name Nahir de Larza became infamous as she earned the grim title of being the youngest woman in Argentine history to receive a life sentence. Nahir's behavior immediately after the crime was chillingly composed. After cold-bloodedly attacking Fernando, she acted as though nothing had happened. At 5:22 a.m., security cameras captured her walking home, calm and seemingly unaffected, showing no signs of fear, distress, or remorse. Once home, she put the weapon away, took a shower, and went to bed, displaying no alarm or guilt. By morning, December 29, 2017, the city of Gualeguay woke up to shocking news. Fernando was found dead next to his motorcycle, having been attacked twice in what was evidently a calculated and callous murder. Initially, the police suspected a robbery, but the details didn't add up. Fernando's wallet, phone, and money remained untouched, and his motorcycle stood upright, with no evidence indicating a struggle or fall. There were no signs of resistance or a physical altercation. This wasn't an accident or random violence, it was calculated, personal, cold-blooded murder. As news of Fernando's death spread through the city, one name was on everyone's lips: Nahir Galarza. Witness accounts painted a dark picture of their relationship. Fernando's friends claimed she humiliated, controlled, and threatened him. The police now had their first lead. Nahir was brought in for questioning. Around the same time, it was reported that a farewell message had appeared on her social media account, stating that Fernando, the love of her life, would be missed. However, her demeanor during interrogation shocked investigators. She appeared cold, indifferent, and unapologetic, speaking about Fernando's death as if it were trivial. She denied being in a serious relationship with him, but the investigators unearthed countless messages, photos, and witness testimonies proving otherwise. Under mounting pressure, Nahir attempted to protect herself by taking drastic measures. Initially, she denied all involvement, but when presented with undeniable evidence, she admitted to attacking Fernando. She claimed it was an act of self-defense, a narrative that contradicted both the physical evidence and the crime scene. The investigation revealed the shots were intentional and methodical, not spontaneous. Additionally, Fernando had shown no signs of aggression or attack against her. Perhaps the most damning evidence of all was her behavior after the murder. Nahir neither called the police nor sought help. Instead, she calmly returned home, making no effort to report the incident. This aspect of her response proved to be her greatest mistake. A passing taxi driver later testified, saying he saw a girl crouched over Fernando's body, seemingly searching for shell casings. This testimony confirmed Nahir's attempt to conceal evidence. She was no victim, she was a killer. Despite her youth, Nahir revealed herself to be cold-blooded and calculating. She believed she could lie, manipulate, and evade justice, but the truth ultimately caught up with her. Nahir faced a trial that not only changed her life but devastated Fernando's family, who had lost their beloved son. That night, not only did a young man lose his life, but the ideals of justice and love were shattered. Yet the lingering question remains: was justice truly served, or did Nahir manage to avoid full accountability? CCTV footage captured Nahir walking home calmly at 5:22 a.m., showing no signs of panic or tears. Additionally, they discovered a shell casing that she had overlooked. A friend of Fernando revealed years of his suffering, describing Nahir's manipulative behavior, cruelty, and relentless jealousy. Police determined that this was not an act of self-defense but a premeditated, cold-blooded murder. Nahir's father, a high-ranking police officer, enlisted the country's top lawyers to lead her defense. Their strategy aimed to shift the narrative, portraying Nahir not as a murderer but as a victim. The defense claimed that Fernando had abused Nahir and that she acted in desperate self-defense. They presented photos of bruises, allegedly caused by hockey training, as evidence of supposed violence. The trial became a spectacle, raising the critical question: who was the victim and who was the aggressor? Nahir tearfully recounted how Fernando had allegedly tortured her, forced her onto a motorcycle that night, attacked her, and that she acted in self-defense. She painted herself as a frightened girl pushed to her limits, but her story began to unravel. Fernando's friends testified about her possessive and controlling behavior, how she created dramatic scenes, knocked him down, and obsessively tracked his every move. Fernando himself had confided to others that he feared her and wanted to escape their toxic relationship. A psychologist, called as a defense witness, made a shocking statement during the trial: Nahir is not a victim but a manipulator and narcissist accustomed to getting her way. This declaration entirely undermined her defense. Even feminist organizations, which had initially rallied in her support and portrayed her as a victim of domestic violence, were unable to sway the court's decision. The evidence was overwhelming. The judges rejected the self-defense claim and instead concluded that her actions were deliberate and calculated. Nahir was sentenced to life imprisonment, becoming the youngest woman in Argentina's history to receive such a sentence. But does this verdict bring Fernando back? Does it ease his family's grief? No, but it delivers justice. After this case, domestic violence gained wider social attention in Argentina. However, it also raised difficult questions. Can one partner be the consistent source of toxicity? Why do so many relationships end in tragedy? And how many individuals like Nahir remain unaccountable for their actions? This case shattered societal stereotypes and forced Argentine society to confront harsh realities. Most disturbingly, it served as a grim reminder that love, in its most toxic form, can have fatal consequences. Despite Nahir's attempts to manipulate the narrative, the truth of her crime could not be concealed. On July 20, 2018, a tense silence filled the courtroom in Gualeguay as the judge delivered the verdict. For Fernando Pastorizzo's family, the decision brought only partial solace. They had endured months of profound grief, compounded by public scrutiny, a drawn-out trial, and attempts to paint their son as the aggressor. While justice prevailed, no verdict would ever bring Fernando back. In the courtroom, Fernando's parents expressed gratitude to the lawyers and everyone who fought to expose the truth, vowing to keep their son's memory alive. The trial of Nahir deeply divided society. The case dominated national media, with her face constantly on television and in newspapers. Public opinion was polarized. Some saw her as an innocent victim unfairly vilified, while others regarded her as a cold-blooded murderer. Regardless of the ongoing debates, the evidence was undisputed. Fernando's family not only lost their beloved son but were also stripped of the chance to witness the future he could have had. Every piece of evidence, every photograph shown in court, was a painful reminder of their irreplaceable loss. Nahir's father, Marcelo Galarza, an influential police officer, lost everything: reputation, career, family. Everything collapsed after his daughter's conviction. In a desperate attempt to escape punishment, Nahir even accused her father of the murder, but the court dismissed this claim as yet another act of manipulation. The trial exposed not only the brutal reality of the crime but also the devastating effects of toxic relationships, abuses of power, and unchecked privilege. The case serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of violence in relationships: manipulation, control, psychological abuse, and sometimes even fatal outcomes. It raises important questions. How do privilege and connections influence justice? Are there sufficient safeguards to protect individuals trapped in toxic relationships? Why is domestic violence not only a women's issue but also one that affects men? Fernando Pastorizzo was more than just a victim. He was a young man with dreams, aspirations, and a future that was cruelly stolen from him. His tragic story is a call to action, a poignant reminder of the importance of justice and the urgent need for change.